When Alexius Comnenus rose to power in 1081, the Byzantine Empire had only just managed to stabilize its northern frontier after years of pressure from the Pechenegs. That danger, though serious, had been contained through hard and costly Sanghersh, allowing the lower Danube line to hold firm for decades. Yet even as the northern threat faded, new dangers gathered from the west, especially across the Adriatic. These developments would place immense strain on Byzantine control over the southern Slavs and the coastal regions stretching from Dalmatia to Dyrrhachium. The most immediate and dangerous challenge came from the Normans, a rising military power in southern Italy. Their ascent had been legitimized decades earlier, when Pope Nicholas II granted Robert Guiscard authority over Apulia and Sicily. These territories had once acknowledged Byzantine supremacy, but that connection weakened as political and religious tensions grew. The appointment of the local ruler, Argyrus, a Latin Christian loyal to Constantinople, had already stirred conflict between Eastern and Western churches. Disputes over religious practices deepened divisions, eventually contributing to the great rupture between Rome and Constantinople. In the aftermath, the papacy sought new allies and found them in the Normans, effectively abandoning Byzantine interests in Italy. With papal support, Norman expansion accelerated rapidly. Cities fell one after another, and within a single campaigning season, they secured key ports across southern Italy. Their ambitions soon turned toward Bari, the last major Byzantine stronghold in the region. Although imperial commanders attempted to resist, organizing fleets and defensive operations, they could not prevent the inevitable. In 1071, Bari fell, marking the end of Byzantine rule in Italy. This loss coincided with a catastrophic defeat in the east, plunging the empire into crisis on multiple fronts. Faced with mounting threats, Byzantine diplomacy took an unexpected turn. Emperor Michael VII sought cooperation with the very power that had dismantled Byzantine authority in Italy. Through a series of negotiations, he attempted to secure an alliance with Robert Guiscard, even proposing a marriage between their families. The language used in these negotiations emphasized shared faith and unity, downplaying the deep theological divide between East and West. The aim was clear: to transform a former enemy into a protector of the empire's western frontier and a source of military aid against the advancing Turks in Anatolia. At the same time, the emperor reached out to the papacy, offering the possibility of church unity in exchange for military support. The Pope responded with enthusiasm, calling on Western rulers to aid the Eastern Christians and even softening theological disagreements for the sake of cooperation. The situation contained all the elements that would later shape the First Crusade: appeals for aid, promises of spiritual reward, and the merging of religious and political objectives. However, these efforts never fully materialized. Internal instability in Constantinople disrupted the agreements, and shifting alliances quickly turned former partners into enemies once more. By the time Alexius Comnenus secured the throne, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The Normans, now encouraged by papal backing, prepared to strike directly at Byzantine territory. The focus of conflict moved to the western Balkans, particularly the strategically vital region of Dyrrhachium. This area served as a gateway between the Adriatic and the interior, making it one of the most important defensive zones in the empire. Dyrrhachium itself was heavily fortified, forming the centerpiece of a broader defensive network. Fortresses stretched across the region, controlling key rivers, mountain passes, and coastal approaches. In the north, strongholds overlooked routes leading into Serbian lands, while further south, fortified ports guarded access to inland valleys. The terrain was difficult, marked by rivers, marshes, and rugged highlands, but the Byzantines had long adapted their defences to these natural features. Watchpoints monitored the coastline, while inland forts secured vital communication lines and trade routes. The city of Dyrrhachium stood out as a major military prize. Its walls were thick and reinforced with towers designed to withstand prolonged siege. Roads leading eastward connected it to the empire's interior, making it essential for both defense and supply. Beyond the city, a chain of smaller fortifications guarded the mountain passes, ensuring that any invading force would face resistance at multiple stages. These positions were not merely defensive outposts. They formed an integrated system meant to delay, weaken, and ultimately repel any Western invasion. In the first months of Alexius I's reign, the Norman attack on Dyrrhachium came with alarming speed. The signs were troubling from the very beginning. The people of Dubrovnik, along with other communities along the Dalmatian coast, provided transport ships for Norman troops. Soon after, the defenders of Corfu handed over the citadel without serious resistance. From there, the invaders moved easily against key coastal points farther south, taking Vonitsa, Butrint, and Valona. Among these, Valona was especially important. Its position gave the Normans access to the inland route through the Vjosa Valley, making it the ideal base for a combined assault by land and sea. Bohemond was meant to march overland toward Dyrrhachium, while the fleet crossed from Italy over the shortest and safest section of the Adriatic. The bay at Valona was deep enough to shelter the heavy transport vessels, and the coastal current favoured a northward approach toward the main target. For George Palaeologus, the Byzantine commander in Dyrrhachium, the greatest immediate danger was not only the enemy outside the walls, but the loyalty of the population within the wider region. The Western Balkans had recently been shaken by repeated rebellions and shifting allegiances, and local support could not be taken for granted. Messages were sent out urging the coastal towns and island communities to remain firm. Yet fear spread quickly as news of Robert Guiscard's advance reached them. The sight of the Norman army and fleet closing in from both land and sea caused deep panic. The invaders may not have been as countless as later writers suggested, but their strength did not rest on numbers alone. Guiscard understood that intimidation, political theatre, and promises could be just as powerful as the sword. His camp grew larger day by day as more men joined him. To strengthen his position further, he brought with him a man presented as the deposed emperor Michael VII, dressed in imperial splendour and displayed before the walls. This was a calculated move. The population of Dyrrhachium remained loyal to the empire, but not all of them were necessarily loyal to the emperor currently on the throne. As long as the citadel held, the city remained in Byzantine hands, yet much of the surrounding countryside quickly drifted toward Norman influence. Palaeologus kept Constantinople informed through a steady flow of reports, and the picture that emerged was grim. Alexius learned that supporters were gathering around Robert from every direction, and that many people, especially the more impressionable, were beginning to believe the pretender truly was the rightful emperor. Faced with a crisis of such scale, Alexius reached for help wherever he could find it. He opened contact with the Turkish ruler in the east, with the German king in the west, and even with the Pope. At the same time, he assembled an army of remarkable variety. Procurianus led heavy infantry out from Adrianople. Other forces included men of Magyar origin settled near Ohrid, thousands of Manichaeans, Western mercenaries, and the Varangian Guard. Alexius also ordered Bodin to bring the Duclians to join him. Advancing through Thessalonica, he then received discouraging news. Palaeologus had already engaged the Normans in open battle outside Dyrrhachium and had been defeated. Wounded and forced back behind the walls, he now faced Norman siege engines, without the relief he had hoped for. His decision to fight before the emperor arrived suggests just how rapidly the situation had been worsening. Alexius and his allies reached the area near Dyrrhachium in mid-October. Norman envoys came to him with proposals, offering to recognise his position and even to abandon their support for the false Michael if certain demands were met. Those terms were unacceptable, and Alexius chose battle. The clash that followed was devastating. It was one of the worst military defeats suffered by the Byzantines in the age, and many leading men fell in the struggle. Alexius himself barely escaped. Dyrrhachium seemed doomed, yet it did not fall at once. The citadel was entrusted to the Venetians, who had come as allies, while the rest of the city was placed under the command of a local military figure from the Albanian lands. This decision reveals how much the emperor depended on regional support. In a frontier city like Dyrrhachium, survival depended not only on soldiers and walls, but also on cooperation from the local elite. That reality became even clearer the following year, when an assembly was held in the city to decide its future. The political circumstances were extraordinary, but the existence of such a gathering was not. Dyrrhachium had its own leading men, powerful figures whose influence mattered in moments of crisis. Similar local councils existed in other coastal cities as well. No emperor could hold this region by force alone. Municipal elites, merchants, and landholders all played a part in determining whether a frontier city would stand firm or open its gates. By this stage, Guiscard's mixture of pressure and reward was beginning to win many of them over. During the summer of 1081, Alexius had appealed to several possible allies, but only Venice responded quickly and with real strength. Venice had its own reasons for acting. Norman expansion across the Adriatic threatened Venetian interests as much as Byzantine ones. Years earlier, another Norman adventurer had occupied cities along the Dalmatian coast, and although local communities had sometimes welcomed outside help against their immediate rivals, Venice had moved decisively to drive the Normans out. By the time Robert Guiscard launched his great offensive, the fear shared by Venice and Byzantium had become far more intense. Alexius offered gifts, privileges, and formal guarantees if the Venetians would dispatch their fleet at once to Dyrrhachium and fight seriously against Norman naval power. Venice accepted. Their ships joined the much weaker Byzantine fleet and gave the defenders new hope. They also bought Alexius valuable time to gather an army for the campaign on land. Yet Venetian involvement also created new complications. After the Byzantine defeat outside Dyrrhachium, the city's future became uncertain. Eventually, it was handed over to Guiscard, and later accounts blamed Venetian elements in the city for the surrender. What seems clear is that the people of Dyrrhachium, faced with the emperor's defeat, the likely renewal of the siege, and the fear of further destruction, chose survival over continued resistance. Some later narratives tried to present the city as dominated by Italian settlers from Amalfi and Venice, but this was certainly an exaggeration. Italians were present and influential, especially in commerce, but they were only one part of a larger urban society. Still, their interests mattered. For merchants, avoiding a long siege and keeping trade alive could outweigh loyalty to a distant government. When sea routes and commercial ties were increasingly controlled by Norman force, those calculations became even more pressing. Behind Venetian military aid stood a much larger bargain. The Doge received high imperial rank and exceptional honours. Venetian influence in Dalmatia and Croatia was recognised on a new level, and privileges were extended to Venetian merchants across the empire. These included warehouses, keys, and major tax exemptions that would make Venetian trade far more profitable than before. Not every market was open to them, since the Byzantines remained cautious about the northern frontier trade with steppe and Russian merchants, but the overall concession was enormous. In effect, Alexius had paid for survival not with ready money, which he lacked, but with commercial opportunity and political prestige. The long-term value of these concessions would become clear in the decades ahead. From 1082 onward, Venetian support proved essential to the Byzantine recovery. Their fleet watched the Adriatic closely while Alexius slowly rebuilt his position on land. At the same time, the emperor began to change the way he fought. After repeated defeats in set battles, he turned increasingly toward diplomacy, deception, bribery, and indirect warfare. One of his first moves was to persuade the German ruler to threaten Norman interests in Italy. This forced Robert Guiscard to cross back over the sea, though he left Bohemond behind to continue the campaign in Byzantine territory. Bohemond advanced boldly and established himself inland. Alexius met him in battle with a newly assembled army full of mercenaries promised heavy rewards. But once again he was defeated. He regrouped and tried again, and once again he failed. The Normans pushed deep into the western Balkans, took important positions, and even laid siege to Ohrid. For a moment the entire region seemed close to slipping away. Even so, Norman progress was not effortless. Some fortresses resisted stubbornly, and Byzantine commanders destroyed positions that the invaders tried to establish. Bohemond achieved major gains farther south, capturing a series of strong places and moving on to besiege Larissa. There, Alexius finally abandoned the idea that he could defeat Norman cavalry in the traditional manner. Instead of seeking honour in open battle, he embraced trickery and terrain. He studied the landscape carefully, looking for ravines, thickets, and broken ground where an ambush could be set. He let the Normans believe that another conventional clash was coming. As they charged toward the imperial position in their usual fashion, Byzantine forces pulled them away, drawing them out and opening a chance to strike their camp. Then, Alexius hit the rear, slaughtered those left behind, and sent archers to attack the Norman horses from a distance. It was one of the first real turning points of the war. After this success, Alexius pressed his advantage through intrigue as much as force. He sent envoys to stir discontent among Bohemond's officers, encouraging them to demand years of unpaid wages. If Bohemond could not satisfy them, the emperor offered them rank and salary in Byzantine service instead. This pressure worked. Bohemond withdrew to Valona and prepared to seek money from his father. In his absence, Alexius recovered lost ground, including Castoria, and returned to Constantinople in triumph. It was not a final victory, but it proved that the Norman advance could be reversed. Robert Guiscard came back in strength in 1084, but by then Alexius had learned a hard lesson. He no longer gambled everything on a single battle. The Norman fleet first faced serious resistance from the Venetians, who won important successes at sea. Once Robert landed and moved inland again, his army found itself trapped between difficult mountains, closely watched passes, and an increasingly effective blockade maintained by Venetian and Byzantine ships. The land was stripped bare by foraging, supplies ran low, and the invaders were gradually worn down. At one point, Robert was forced into a port where bad winds and enemy ships held him in place for weeks. Hunger spread through the camp, and losses mounted heavily before a withdrawal could finally be made. Alexius had discovered the most effective way to defend Dyrrhachium, not through reckless courage, but through attrition, terrain, naval coordination, and patience. By the late 11th century, it had become increasingly difficult to deny that Alexius Comnenus helped set in motion the events that led to the First Crusade. Pressed hard by enemies on multiple fronts, he needed soldiers, and he needed them quickly. Danger still pressed on the empire from the north, while Turkish power remained a constant threat in the east. In that atmosphere, Alexius sent urgent appeals across Western Christendom, asking for armed assistance. At first, What he seems to have wanted was not a vast popular movement, but compact and useful military support, especially cavalry that could be directed where the empire needed it most. One of the clearest signs of this effort can be seen in the tradition surrounding a letter sent to Robert of Flanders. The surviving version is unreliable in its present form, yet it almost certainly reflects a genuine request from the emperor. Alexius had reason to expect help from the Flemish count, who had earlier passed through Constantinople and seems to have promised mounted troops. Those men were eventually sent and were quickly used in the defence of northwestern Asia Minor, where Turkish raids threatened the approaches to the imperial heartland. Some historians once argued that the language associated with such appeals, especially its strong religious tone, was too Western in spirit to have come from a Byzantine emperor. But Alexius clearly understood what moved Western knights. He knew the emotional power of Jerusalem, the appeal of fighting non-Christians, and the promise of glory or even martyrdom in holy war. Long before large crusading armies arrived, he had already learned how to speak in terms that Western nobles would understand. Another Western account, written not long after the first wave of crusading, points in the same direction. It describes Alexius sending envoys widely, carrying messages filled with grief, urgency, and promises of reward for those who would come to the aid of Eastern Christians. In that telling, the emperor succeeded in gathering large numbers of Western fighters, even before the full crusading movement took shape. This matters because Western service in Byzantium was nothing new. Franks and Normans had fought for emperors before, and Alexius himself had already used them in earlier struggles. What changed in the 1090s was not the existence of Western military service, but its scale, its religious framing, and the way events slipped beyond the limits the emperor had originally imagined. There is sometimes a tendency to picture Alexius at this stage as a ruler, exhausted by endless campaigning, finally ready to turn inward and concentrate on repair and administration. But the wider political situation in the eastern Mediterranean offered him a rare chance that he could hardly ignore. Across the Muslim world, major regimes were entering periods of instability. Powerful rulers and ministers died in quick succession, and the struggles that followed shattered the balance that had held for years. Rival claimants fought for power, regional authorities asserted themselves, and the cohesion of large Islamic states weakened at a critical moment. For a Byzantine emperor determined to recover lost honour and territory, this was an opportunity unlike any he had seen before. Alexius understood that the empire could not exploit such a moment alone. Anatolia had been badly damaged, the army was still recovering, and the empire's frontiers remained exposed. So he widened his call for help. Letters went westward not just to individual rulers, but more broadly into the political and religious networks of Latin Europe. Later, Greek and Latin traditions preserved the memory of these appeals in different ways, sometimes openly, sometimes reluctantly. Some Byzantine writers preferred to present the crusade as an unexpected storm that burst over the empire from abroad. That version was politically convenient, especially once relations between Byzantium and the Crusaders had soured. Yet other traditions preserve a different picture. An emperor who deliberately invited Western arms eastward, using careful diplomacy, religious language, and political calculation to bring them there. Western retellings of Pope Urban II's preaching also preserve echoes of this earlier Byzantine appeal. They speak of terrible reports arriving from Constantinople and the East, of Christian lands devastated by Turkish advance, and of a Greek realm stripped of wide territories. These themes did not appear in a vacuum. They reflect a message already circulating before the great sermon campaigns gathered momentum. At the Council of Piacenza in 1095, envoys from the Byzantine emperor reportedly asked humbly for military assistance against the forces threatening his dominions. From there, the appeal entered a much larger arena. Urban took up the cause, transformed it, and preached it with a force that reached far beyond what Alexius had expected. What the emperor had sought was help. What he received was a movement. That difference would shape everything that followed. Instead of a manageable flow of mounted contingents or noble-led companies available for imperial service, entire masses of Western Christians began moving east. Nobles, knights, poorer warriors, camp followers, and religious enthusiasts all entered the same current. It was no longer a matter of hiring seasoned troops. A broad social upheaval was now on the march, and the Byzantine frontier had to absorb it. For the empire, the Western Balkans became the first great testing ground. The armies and crowds of the crusade reached Byzantine territory by several routes, and two of the main approaches led toward Dyrrhachium and its surrounding frontier zone. The first armed pilgrims to arrive did not come through the southern Adriatic at all, but through Hungary and the Danube corridor. Their arrival exposed the tensions built into Byzantine frontier administration. At Belgrade, one Western group found itself unable to buy food from the local authorities. Suspicion ran high. The newcomers were treated less as guests than as potential raiders or spies. The situation quickly turned violent when the Crusaders began seizing livestock from nearby fields. Fighting broke out, and the entire episode revealed how uncertain local leaders were when confronted with a large body of armed foreigners. The local ruler in the border zone was not necessarily integrated into the emperor's broader plans and may not even have known that Western fighters had been invited into imperial service. The contrast became clear as soon as the same group entered an area under more direct Byzantine supervision. At Nis, imperial authority responded differently. Compensation was arranged. Gifts were distributed, and the Crusaders were guided onward under escort. From there, they moved through the Great Balkan route toward Constantinople, able to buy supplies and continue their journey with a degree of order. The frontier had done what it was supposed to do: delay, contain, and redirect the movement until central authority could take hold. This pattern repeated when a much larger and less disciplined host, led by Peter the Hermit, came pouring through the same corridor. These people were far less useful to the emperor as soldiers, and their passage was hurried along as quickly as possible. Once they were pushed into Asia Minor, they were soon destroyed by the Turks. Their fate showed the gap between imperial planning and the uncontrolled reality of the crusading tide. The frontier system worked in part because geography still mattered. The wooded and difficult lands between Belgrade and Nis slowed Western movement and gave imperial officers time to prepare. What happened in the northwest also has a close parallel in the west, around Dyrrhachium. There too, the governor was expected to receive incoming crusading forces, manage them, provision them where possible, and send them onward before they became dangerous. In the summer of 1096, the governor of Dyrrhachium dealt with envoys from Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the French king. Hugh himself was thrown ashore by a storm near the Dyrrhachium coast and was quickly brought under official supervision. Instead of being allowed to move freely, he was escorted toward Constantinople on a route chosen by the emperor. The message was clear: the empire would receive crusading leaders, but on imperial terms. Other Western contingents reached the empire by sea and landed in the same general region, including forces associated with Bohemond, the emperor's old Norman enemy. One of the few major leaders who came overland along the Dalmatian coast faced a brutal journey. The route was harsh, narrow, and poor, hemmed in by mountains and sea. Food was scarce, the terrain unforgiving, and local attacks frequent. Bands from the highlands harassed the march repeatedly. Supplies ran out before the travellers reached the safety of Byzantine territory, and only after crossing into the lands more directly controlled from Dyrrhachium did they finally receive organised support. From that point on, imperial agents and escorts managed their progress toward the capital. This repeated pattern reveals something important about the western frontier. In the lands outside firm imperial control, provisions were limited, markets were uncertain, and local communities were either unable or unwilling to support large foreign hosts. The periphery was thinly settled and not designed to welcome mass movement. In contrast, once the Crusaders entered areas under strong Byzantine administration, food, supervision, and guarded passage became available. The empire could handle a massive influx of armed Westerners so long as those Westerners remained in motion and showed no intention of settling. In that sense, the frontier system still functioned effectively. But among all these passing leaders, one figure stood apart because he had ambitions that reached beyond pilgrimage. That figure was Bohemond. Although later Byzantine memory turned him into a familiar villain, the relationship between Alexius and Bohemond during the First Crusade was more complex than hostile storytelling would suggest. The two men had already fought one another and knew each other well. That familiarity may actually have opened the door to negotiation. At one stage, Alexius seems to have accepted Bohemond as a useful intermediary among the crusading princes and may even have considered rewarding him with land, rank, or office in the east. Yet this tentative understanding collapsed around Antioch. Bohemond claimed that the emperor had failed the Crusaders by not bringing sufficient support, while Alexius saw Antioch as a city that should return to imperial authority. When the city fell and Bohemond kept it for himself, the relationship hardened into open rivalry. Over the next few years, Byzantine pressure on Norman power in Syria increased. Imperial commanders moved by sea and land against territories linked to Bohemond's position. Control of the surrounding coastline and neighbouring regions gradually narrowed his room for manoeuvre. Unable to secure his position in Antioch, without broader support, Bohemond returned to the west in 1104 to raise a new army. But he did not present his new campaign as a war for Antioch alone. Instead, he portrayed the Byzantine emperor as a deceitful obstacle to the crusading cause and tried to gather support for an expedition directed against Constantinople itself. His standing rose further through marriage alliances with Western royalty, and the danger to Byzantium became immediate and serious. Alexius reacted with impressive speed. He launched a broad diplomatic effort to block Bohemond's plans before they matured into a united Western coalition. Letters went out across Europe countering Bohemond's accusations and discouraging any new mass movement against the empire. One of the emperor's greatest concerns was the possibility that Bohemond might secure strong support from Hungary. If that happened, the empire could face a two-directional threat: armies coming down through the Danube frontier while Norman forces struck across the Adriatic. In such a scenario, the lands between the Danube and Constantinople would become dangerously exposed, and the whole Western Balkans might be lost. To prevent this, Alexius moved to secure the Hungarian relationship for himself. A marriage alliance was arranged between the Byzantine imperial family and the Hungarian royal house, and the Hungarian princess Piroska was brought to Constantinople early. This was both a diplomatic guarantee and a political safeguard. By tying Hungary to Byzantium, Alexius reduced the chance that Bohemond could use the northern route successfully. With the Hungarian threat contained, the Norman leader was left to pursue the more difficult path of invasion across the southern Adriatic. This was precisely the field on which Alexius now wanted the contest to be fought. By this time, the emperor had learned from every earlier Norman war. He knew that no Western invader could hold gains in the Balkans without first taking Dyrrhachium, the great bridgehead linking southern Italy to Albania. Without that city, any conquest inland would remain fragile, exposed to attack from sea, mountain passes, and the rear. So the city was prepared carefully for siege, and Alexius prepared something even more important: a system for trapping the besiegers once they arrived. When a new governor took charge of Dyrrhachium, his first duty was to strengthen the defences. Across the surrounding region, key passes were blocked, local strong points reinforced, and commanders assigned to critical positions. Roads into the highlands were obstructed by barriers made from felled timber. The defence was no longer centred on one city alone. It had become a coordinated frontier strategy. Even so, the campaign did not begin perfectly. A Byzantine naval commander failed to prevent Bohemond's crossing, and Norman forces seized several important fortresses, including Valona. Worse still, Bohemond managed to win over local people familiar with the mountain routes, allowing him to bypass some of the obstacles laid in his path. Once again, the emperor was reminded that walls and fleets were not enough. The loyalty of local populations remained decisive. Still, Alexius adapted rapidly. A more capable naval commander replaced the earlier one, tightening control over the sea passages and making further Norman crossings difficult. From then on, the imperial strategy focused less on dramatic battle and more on containment. Bohemond was allowed to advance into a trap of shortage, delay, and attrition. He could not easily abandon the siege of Dyrrhachium because without the city, his whole campaign would collapse. Yet the longer he remained before its walls, the worse his position became. The sea was increasingly closed to him. The surrounding highlands were secured by Byzantine forces. Foraging parties were ambushed. Supplies failed. Meanwhile, the city itself was kept steady by regular contact with the emperor, by adequate provisioning, and by active measures to prevent betrayal or panic among the inhabitants. The frontier defences that had once seemed reactive and fragile now operated with much greater maturity. They had evolved with the emperor himself. Eventually the pressure told. Bohemond's momentum broke, and negotiations followed. The agreement that emerged, known later as the Treaty of Devol, was one of the most striking examples of Alexius's political flexibility. Instead of insisting only on traditional Byzantine formulas, the emperor used concepts that Western rulers and nobles would understand. Bohemond accepted high rank within the imperial order and in effect recognized that his authority in the east would be held from the emperor and tied to imperial approval. He was offered honours, office, income, and legitimacy, but all within a framework that placed him beneath the Byzantine ruler. In Western terms, the agreement resembled vassalage. In Byzantine terms, it was another way of binding a frontier lord to the emperor through hierarchy, obligation, and reward. The language differed, but the political purpose was much the same. In practice, the settlement never fully took effect. Bohemond did not return to Antioch, and those who ruled there afterward had little reason to respect his promises. So the struggle over Antioch continued under Alexius and his son. Yet, in another sense, Devol was a major success. It ended the immediate Norman threat to the southern Adriatic and showed that the defences centred on Dyrrhachium could now deter large-scale Western invasion. For much of the 12th century, no comparable attack would again break through that frontier. The cost of reaching this point had been immense, but the result was lasting. Latin Christendom did not expand in a single direction or through a single people. Its movement outward took many shapes, and while the Norman advance and the mainly Frankish crusading expeditions were among the most visible early examples, they were not the only ones. Around Byzantium's Balkan frontier, other Latin Christian powers were also pushing forward. Venice, for instance, was steadily widening both its political reach and its commercial network. At first, this happened in cooperation with Emperor Alexius, since Venetian support was useful in containing the Norman threat. But the growth of Latin strongholds in the eastern Mediterranean created fresh possibilities for a maritime power that was flexible, ambitious, and highly skilled at profiting from unstable frontier conditions. These settlements were isolated, vulnerable, and often surrounded by enemies, with the sea serving as their only dependable link to the wider Christian world. For a city like Venice, such conditions were not a disadvantage, but an opening. At the same time, another people, already transformed by the end of the 11th century, began to play a larger role in the region. The Magyars, who had once entered the Carpathian Basin as a nomadic force, had over generations moved toward a more settled political order. Their kingdom, known in English as Hungary, had developed into a Christian monarchy, though some older patterns had not entirely disappeared. Both Venetians and Hungarians now had strong reasons to compete for influence in Dalmatia. Venice wanted dominance over the northern Adriatic and sought to control both shores of that sea. Hungary, by contrast, wanted reliable access to the coast so that it could connect itself politically and commercially with the wider Mediterranean. Hungarian rulers also looked south and southeast, towards Sirmium and the neighbouring Slavic lands, seeing in them opportunities to expand deeper into areas that had once formed part of Byzantium's effective frontier. The relative silence of Byzantine narrative sources has often distorted the picture of this period. Greek writers from the age of John II say surprisingly little about the emperor, and when they do speak of him, their accounts are shaped by strong personal or political motives. That makes it difficult to reconstruct his Balkan policy from literary evidence alone. For that reason, the setting along the Hungarian-Byzantine frontier in the later 11th century must be approached through a broader combination of political, military, and material evidence. The first Hungarian settlements in the Carpathian Basin had been concentrated in the middle Danube region around Buda. To the north and south, there remained wide unsettled zones, and these empty areas served as protective belts between the Hungarians and neighbouring powers. Even when Hungarian settlements spread and agriculture widened across the basin, such defensive spaces were preserved where possible. The kingdom's border policy could still be extremely harsh. In the year 1074, when danger threatened from the German king Henry IV, the Hungarian ruler Géza I prepared by ordering a scorched earth defence in vulnerable frontier districts. Supplies were to be removed, grazing land denied, and the enemy left without food or fodder. In addition to this, the borderlands were reinforced with obstacles designed especially to slow mounted troops. Fences of sharpened stakes, backed by trenches, restricted movement, and passageways through these barriers were watched by fortified gates that served not only military purposes but also fiscal ones, since tolls could be collected there. Géza's approach to Byzantium was considerably more conciliatory. Around 1075 he married into a Byzantine aristocratic family, and at roughly the same time he received the famous crown that linked his image with that of Emperor Michael VII and the imperial household. This gift was far more than a piece of regalia. Its arrangement expressed a political message that would have been perfectly clear in Constantinople. The imagery placed Géza within a hierarchy headed by the emperor, suggesting not equality but a recognised and honourable subordination. In the climate of the 1070s, when the empire was increasingly on the defensive, older ideas about a ranked order of Christian states regained importance in Byzantine diplomacy. Although earlier imperial theory had strongly discouraged the export of crowns, this gift signalled that the empire now accepted the existence of a legitimate Christian kingdom north of the Danube, ruled by Géza as faithful king of Hungary. At the same time, the gesture seems to have acknowledged the existing political arrangement concerning Sirmium and its surrounding district. Sirmium, the old Roman centre later known as Sremska Mitrovica, stood on the north bank of the Sava, west of its meeting point with the Danube. Its Roman defences had once been formidable, and there is some indication that a portion of the site, was reoccupied in the age of Basil II. Yet after that, and firm evidence for sustained Byzantine control becomes very thin. The Church of St. Demetrius may have remained as a small marker of Byzantine presence, but even that is uncertain. Excavations have not produced the sort of coin finds that would point to a clear Byzantine urban revival in the later 11th century. Across the river, however, at Macevanska Mitrovica, the remains of 3 successive churches have been found, the latest of them dating from the early 11th century. Nearby coin finds and settlement evidence suggest that this southern zone continued to function as an ecclesiastical centre. But the city itself had passed into Hungarian hands. That change had come in 1071, when the Hungarians moved aggressively down the Morava corridor and plundered Niš. During that campaign, King Salomon carried off the arm of Saint Procopius from Niš and placed it in the Church of St. Demetrius at Sirmium. From then on, possession of the relic became a symbolic sign of possession of the city itself. When Manuel I later recaptured Sirmium, he made a point of returning the relic to Niš, showing how closely political control and sacred symbolism had become intertwined. There is little reason to doubt that Sirmium remained under Hungarian authority from its capture in 1071 until its recovery by Byzantium in the mid-12th century. Some have argued for an earlier Byzantine restoration, partly because a seal connected with Alexius Comnenus was found across the river, but that piece of evidence proves very little. It may simply have belonged to correspondence sent to the Orthodox bishop in the region. Other later details point in the opposite direction. A palace stood in Sirmium under Hungarian rule, and when it was destroyed during Manuel's later operations, Byzantine writers described the act in terms meant to emphasize its importance. Hungarian power was not limited to the city itself. It was also recognized in the lands to the north, in the district known in Greek as Frangochorion, and later associated with Fruška Gora. Byzantine documentation from a later period still bluntly identified Sirmium as Hungarian territory. The wider border zone had a mixed character. A Catholic archbishop operated in the region at the same time as an Orthodox metropolitan, based farther north at Bax, showing that ecclesiastical life followed the political complexity of the frontier. Archaeology strengthens the impression of a shared and layered society. Sites near Bax and elsewhere have yielded objects common to Slavic communities, south of the Danube alongside contemporary Hungarian coinage. The main fortified centres of the region included not only Sirmium but also Haram and Semlin, the latter standing opposite Belgrade on the north bank of the Sava. Semlin is especially memorable because it appears in accounts of the First Crusade. When the followers of Peter the Hermit reached the town in 1096, it was under the authority of a Hungarian governor named Guz, one of the king's trusted men. He worked with his counterpart in Belgrade to resist the disorderly crusaders and displayed weapons and goods seized from earlier pilgrims along the walls. The result was predictable. Peter's followers, inflamed by what they saw, stormed the city under a rain of arrows. The episode reveals not only the tension along the frontier, but also the degree to which these towns had become active border posts of the Hungarian kingdom. Trade between Byzantium and Hungary continued through this period, and salt remained one of its most valuable commodities. The Arpad dynasty had secured control over tolls connected with this trade as early as the 1020s, and by the late 12th century, salt had become one of the crown's most important sources of revenue. Yet the kings themselves were not the direct operators of this commerce. Much of it appears to have been dominated by merchants of Khazar background. The Magyars had entered the Carpathian Basin with allied groups, including tribes of Khazar origin, and later arrivals strengthened this element. The Christian Hungarians of Magyar origin thus shared their kingdom with Muslim and Jewish merchant communities, who played a major role in long-distance trade. Royal legislation shows that their influence was considerable. Laws from the end of the 11th century already sought to restrict the power of merchants described as Ishmaelites, and later measures tried to prevent Muslims and Jews from holding public offices connected with the salt trade. These laws make sense only if their role in revenue collection and commercial administration was already strong enough to worry the crown. The road between Szeged and the Danube was even known as the Khazar Road, and regional treasuries connected with this trade carried names and coin types that reflected this unusual mixture of political authority and commercial culture. The southern borderlands of the Hungarian kingdom were important enough to justify the creation of special offices for collecting royal revenues. One was based at Arad on the Maros, another at Titel near the lower Tisa. Only a few such regional centres existed elsewhere in the kingdom. Salt was central, but it was not the only good in circulation. Luxury items from Byzantium, especially jewellery, continued to be desired north of the Danube. On the frontier settlements stretching between Vidin and Sirmium, however, archaeology suggests a world that was largely self-sufficient in common goods. Large numbers of belt buckles, pectoral crosses, fish hooks, and arrowheads have been found. Pottery is by far the most common material. Most of it was locally produced on slow wheels from simple clay mixtures, creating a broad and fairly uniform ceramic tradition spread across much of the Balkans. Potters' marks appear frequently, but standard shapes and decorations make it nearly impossible to identify individual workshops or trace exact trading routes. Alongside this ordinary pottery, there was a finer type made from better clay that fired to a yellow-orange colour. This second kind appears in small quantities all along the Danube but not in the interior, suggesting that it was carried by river traffic, perhaps from the lower Danube. Distinctive clay cauldrons associated with steppe or nomadic traditions have also been found at places such as Belgrade and Machvanska Mitrovica. Their distribution strongly suggests movement through Hungarian commercial networks. Goods, clearly made in Constantinople, are rare in this northern zone, except around the Iron Gates, where characteristic glazed wares and decorated jugs appear more often. By the closing years of the 11th century, a Hungarian rule over Sirmium and its surrounding marches seems to have been solid and accepted by Byzantium in practice, if not always in sentiment. Byzantine coins and ornaments show that exchange across the frontier remained active, with trade routes running through Braničevo and Belgrade toward the Hungarian lands around Szeged. At the same time, Hungary was looking for ways to extend its economic and political influence still farther south among the Slavs and westward toward the Adriatic. Having become part of the commercial system of East-Central Europe, the kingdom now wanted access to the profitable sea routes and markets of Dalmatia and the Mediterranean. Along the Dalmatian coast, the maritime cities were growing richer throughout the 11th and early 12th centuries. Archaeological work there has focused more on buildings than on commerce, so the physical record of trade is incomplete. Still, underwater finds have produced large numbers of amphorae, of types also known in other parts of the Byzantine world. Certain vessel forms found near Dubrovnik, Split, Šibenik, and the island of Krapanj closely resemble those known from Istanbul, as well as from places like Athens, Corinth, and Corfu. This suggests that Dalmatia was fully tied into wider eastern Mediterranean exchange. Written evidence for the exact scale of trade before the 13th century is limited, but later city statutes preserve older customs that clearly reflect long-established commercial habits. Dubrovnik provides the best example. Its later law code gave formal shape to regulations that had been developing for generations. The economy of the city was shaped above all by the rocky, unproductive nature of the coastal strip and by the urban and religious habits inherited from the Roman past and from Latin Christianity. Wine, therefore, became the most important local product. The surrounding regions had supplied vineyards to Dubrovnik for centuries. Local wine was prestigious and politically significant enough to be offered ceremonially to major rulers. In Split too, vineyards were a foundation of urban wealth, and their destruction could force a city to submit. The importance of wine was not merely economic, it touched liturgical life as well, since without it, the Eucharist itself could not be celebrated. Because of this, the cultivation and sale of wine were carefully controlled. Vine planting was restricted, likely in order to keep prices high, and foreign wine was generally barred from the local market, especially wine from nearby competing districts. Exceptions existed, but they were tightly defined. Wine in transit, or wine consumed privately by foreign merchants and their crews, could sometimes be tolerated. Similar rules existed in Kotor and in Trogir. Even the city's ruler could import foreign wine only for personal use, never for resale or public distribution. The cities were protecting local producers with deliberate care. Salt was just as important. Dubrovnik had no salt pans of its own, so all salt had to be imported. The management of this trade was considered important enough that the city official responsible for municipal salt ranked among the most significant functionaries in the urban hierarchy. Imported salt normally had to be sold through official channels, unless a special license was granted. The penalties for bypassing this system were severe, including fines and confiscation. Trogir followed a similar pattern. These regulations show how closely trade, taxation, and urban government were connected. The prosperity and security of the Dalmatian cities also depended on ships, and that meant timber. Wood, especially pine suitable for shipbuilding, was always in demand and local supplies were insufficient. Some of the earliest commercial agreements between Dalmatian cities and Italian towns may have been driven by the need to secure regular timber imports. Timber also came from the inland highlands. Another commodity from the interior was even more profitable: slaves. The trade in human beings remained an ugly but significant feature of the region's economy. Legal records indicate formal procedures for the sale of slaves, and evidence survives for their use in agriculture, domestic service, monasteries, and maritime labour. They worked vineyards, appeared in property settlements, and were attached to churches and landed estates. In the commercial world of the Adriatic, slaves were not marginal. They were deeply woven into the structure of urban wealth. It is easy to see why Hungarian kings were drawn toward Dalmatia. If revenues from trade in the Danubian zone already formed a major part of royal income, the maritime cities promised still greater rewards. Koloman, who secured the Hungarian throne after a contested succession in 1095, recognized this clearly. He was also eager for international legitimacy. He aligned himself with Pope Urban II and strengthened ties with the Norman world through marriage. In Constantinople, this combination of papal alliance, Norman connection, and Hungarian expansion looked deeply alarming. Matters became worse when Koloman invaded Croatia in 1097, killed the local ruler Peter, and seized Beograd on the coast. The first reaction, however, came not from Byzantium but from Venice. Acting with what was almost certainly imperial approval, the Doge sailed to Trogir and Split, extracted oaths of loyalty, and imposed military obligations. Venetian interest in Dalmatia was driven by the same reality that attracted Hungary. The cities were wealthy. But Venice wanted more than revenue. It wanted to control potential commercial rivals in the fast-growing Adriatic trade network that linked the Latin West with Byzantium and the Crusader states. Because Venice acted quickly, Hungary did not immediately dominate Dalmatia. Instead, a Venetian-Hungarian agreement was reached around 1098, directed mainly against the Normans. Yet this arrangement contained an important and troubling implication. Venice and Hungary recognized one another's spheres of influence in the northern Adriatic, with Croatia leaning toward Hungary and the Dalmatian maritime cities toward Venice. The Byzantine emperor was not acknowledged in this division, even if the arrangement suited imperial interests in opposing Norman expansion. Its quiet dismissal of Byzantine legal claims in Dalmatia must have unsettled Alexius. After this, relations with Venice became more guarded. The emperor still needed Venetian support at times, but he no longer treated the Republic with the same confidence. In 1102, Coloman moved to regularize his authority in Croatia and secure the cooperation of a nobility known for rebellion. The agreements associated with this settlement confirmed his position, and he was crowned King of Croatia at Beograd. His adoption of the title King of Croatia and Dalmatia clearly signaled wider ambitions along the Adriatic coast. Even so, there is little sign that he immediately imposed direct authority over the maritime cities. In the years that followed, his dealings with them seem limited, mostly to confirming monastic and ecclesiastical property rights. Then, in 1105, the situation changed dramatically. That year marked a turning point in the balance of power in the northern Balkans. Alexius was facing renewed danger from Bohemond and feared that the Normans might combine with Hungary, placing the empire under pressure on two fronts. This concern helps explain the speed with which the emperor arranged the marriage between his son John and Piroska, daughter of the late Hungarian king Ladislas. With a Byzantine-Hungarian understanding now in place, Coloman was free to move against the Dalmatian cities. The campaign of 1105 was carefully prepared. A fleet was sent toward the islands of the Kavarna Gulf, under the command of Ban Ugra, while Coloman himself advanced against Zadar, the strongest and most important city in northern Dalmatia. There, as in later stages of the campaign, success came as much through negotiation as through force. The Bishop of Trogir played a central role in arranging peaceful submission. A triumphal inscription later commemorated Coloman's entry into Zadar. From there, the Hungarians moved on to Šibenik, Trogir, and finally Split, where once again an ecclesiastical mediator helped secure terms. The privileges Coloman granted to the cities after their submission are especially revealing. They show that the king did not simply impose foreign rule by force. Instead, he worked through existing urban institutions and offered a settlement designed to win cooperation while ensuring revenue. The citizens were allowed to continue electing their bishop and their secular head, the prior, according to established custom, though royal confirmation remained necessary. This is important because it shows that under earlier Byzantine overlordship, the cities had largely governed themselves in both civil and ecclesiastical affairs. The prior managed treaties, defence, and relations with outside powers, but bishops too could act as diplomats and negotiators. This dual structure survived the Hungarian conquest. At the same time, royal confirmation gave Coloman an opening to shape appointments in his favour, as later happened when he secured the elevation of a loyal Hungarian to the Archbishopric of Split. The cities were also freed from tribute. This was a striking gesture. It suggests that they had still been paying obligations inherited from earlier arrangements with the Croats. Coloman abolished this old burden, but not out of simple generosity. He replaced it with a more lucrative system. Duties paid by foreign merchants entering the ports were divided between the king and the local prior, with a share assigned to the bishop. Here lay the real financial prize of Dalmatia. Trade taxes enriched the crown while also tying local elites to the new political order. Hungarian officials were installed in some places to supervise enforcement, but they did not replace the native prior. Instead, dual administration became the norm. Native leaders remained in place while royal officers watched over revenue and military security. This arrangement could be flexible, but it also created room for confusion, especially since Latin terminology often used the same title for local priors, Hungarian nobles, and royal governors. Other clauses protected the cities from outside domination. Hungarians and other foreigners could not settle in the cities without local consent. The citizens had no duty to house the king or his retinue unless they chose to do so. Anyone expelled from the city could seek refuge in royal territory with family and possessions intact. Each provision served local interests on the surface, but each also strengthened Colomon's position. Restricting settlement prevented the rise of independent Hungarian magnates in the cities. Limiting obligations toward the king made his rule seem lighter than that of Venice. Offering refuge to exiles gave him access to politically useful men who might later be employed against urban rivals. For a few years, Venice accepted the Hungarian takeover. The Doge was preoccupied with the Holy Land and with problems in Italy, and Venice also wished to preserve good relations with Byzantium. But in 1112, the Republic decided to act. An embassy was sent to Constantinople to remind Alexius of Venetian services and to ask for support in recovering Dalmatia. The emperor delayed. His hesitation is understandable. He had no desire to rupture relations with either Venice or Hungary, both of whom had recently been useful allies. Yet Venetian patience did not last. In 1115, the Doge launched an expedition on his own. The result was mixed. Venice reasserted control in the Kvarner region, and perhaps in parts of the mainland, but key strongholds such as Beograd and Zadar remained in Hungarian hands. The death of Koloman in February 1116 changed everything. His successor, Stephen, was only 15 years old. In May, the Doge returned, now supported by Alexius. In July, the Venetians defeated the Hungarians in open battle, captured Zadar, and pushed on against other centres, including Šibenik. Hungarian resistance was strongest in Split, where Archbishop Manasses secretly worked with the Hungarian garrison. But the city's own prior exposed the plan, and the citizens moved first, attacking the Hungarian stronghold inside the walls. The incident shows how fragile Hungarian control had become and how alive municipal politics still were. The cities then transferred their loyalty to Venice, but once again on terms that preserved much of their autonomy. The privileges granted by the Doge closely resembled those earlier negotiated with Koloman. When Alexius died in August 1118, he was succeeded by John II. One of John's first major decisions was to refuse renewal of the commercial privileges Venice had previously enjoyed in the empire. For several years, Venetian merchants continued to trade in Constantinople, but under worse conditions. In 1122, Venice responded with force. A fleet attacked Corfu and then moved eastward, where events in the Levant offered both profit and glory. Venetian successes at sea and in the Crusader states only increased the Republic's desire to secure similar privileges throughout the Byzantine world. On the return journey, Venetian forces seized several Byzantine islands, and John II was finally compelled to negotiate and restore their advantages. At almost the same moment, Stephen II of Hungary tried to recover Dalmatia. His prestige had suffered from earlier defeats, and his record elsewhere was not impressive. A marriage alliance with the Norman world may have encouraged him to act against Venetian power. In 1124, he launched a successful invasion, regained territory, and confirmed the familiar urban privileges of cities, such as Trogir and Split. But Venice responded quickly. The Doge returned from the east, determined to reassert control. The campaign was carried out as a performance of power, the Venetians drove out the Hungarians, punished Beograd severely by destroying the city, and rewarded Zadar in a way that advertised both vengeance and generosity. For roughly the next 2 decades, Venice held Dalmatia from the Kvarner Gulf southward, perhaps even extending influence toward Dubrovnik. At first, Venetian rule does not seem to have relied on replacing native leaders, with Venetian governors in every city. Later, chronicles claimed otherwise, but contemporary evidence suggests a more cautious approach. In Zadar, for example, the leading figure after the Venetian recovery was Peter, who was not a Venetian outsider, but a local prior. His judges were native men bearing both Slavic and Latin names, and one was his own brother. The pattern suggests that Venice, like Hungary before it, often preferred to rule through local elites, rather than destroy municipal traditions outright. A later record even indicates that Peter had already held office under Hungarian overlordship. His authority may have reached widely across Dalmatia, and possibly toward Dubrovnik as well. The broader picture is clear. The northern Balkans and Adriatic littoral in the late 11th and early 12th centuries formed a contested zone where Hungary, Venice, and Byzantium all pursued overlapping ambitions. Hungary expanded southward from a strengthened Danubian base, combining military pressure, commercial interest, and diplomatic calculation. Venice sought control of maritime cities, not only for wealth, but also to master the sea routes, tying the eastern Mediterranean together. Byzantium, weakened but still politically active, tried to balance these powers while protecting what remained of its influence. The cities themselves were not passive prizes. They negotiated, resisted, shifted loyalties, and defended their autonomy whenever possible. Their rulers, bishops, merchants, and citizens shaped events at every stage. What emerged wasn't a simple story of conquest, but a fluid struggle over trade, legitimacy, and access to the sea, fought across a frontier where power was rarely absolute and where success often belonged to the side best able to turn local conditions to its advantage. Very little direct evidence survives from the reign of John Comnenus, and that silence has shaped the way later generations have understood him. Compared with the dramatic and carefully constructed image of his father Alexius, John stands in the shadows of Byzantine writing. Anna Komnena, who wrote soon after his death, barely mentions her brother at all. That silence was not accidental. Before John was born, Anna had expected a very different future. She had been promised Constantine Ducas, and had once imagined herself inheriting imperial power through that union. After Alexius died, she and her mother tried to block John's accession and place her own husband, Nicephorus Bryennius, on the throne. The plan failed. Bryennius would not act, John secured power, and Anna ended her life in enforced withdrawal, turning to writing after losing the political struggle. Her hostility remained visible. At one point, she suggested that all the achievements of Alexius had been wasted by those who followed him, an unmistakable attack on her brother. She was inviting readers to compare the greatness of the father with the supposed inadequacy of the son. The problem is that modern readers do not possess the same living memory of John's reign that her audience might once have had, and the other sources that survive do not fully resolve the issue. One of the rare moments when John's rule comes into clearer focus is the conflict with Hungary in the years between 11 to 27 and 11 to 29. Two important Byzantine writers discuss these events, and their accounts reveal as much about literary intention as they do about military history. Both John Cinemus and Nicetas Choniates describe the war, but neither wrote with John as his true centre of interest. Both treated his reign largely as the necessary lead-up to the much more celebrated rule of his son Manuel. For a long time, it was assumed that these two narratives could be read together to form a fuller picture. In reality, each writer shaped the story, to serve a larger argument about imperial character. Cinemus, who served as Manuel's secretary, wrote in a style that constantly elevated Manuel as the ideal warrior emperor. Choniates, more independent and often sharper in judgment, seems at times to push back against that courtly image. The clash between their versions makes the Hungarian War especially revealing, because it shows how deeply Byzantine historical writing could be shaped by rhetoric, comparison, and political purpose. It also makes clear that Hungary was never treated by John as the central problem of his reign or as a lasting strategic obsession. In Choniates's version, the campaign of 1127 appears as a clear and decisive demonstration of imperial strength. He says that during the summer the Hungarians crossed the Danube and ravaged Braničevo. They tore down its walls and carried off the stones to Semlin. They also attacked Sardica, violating earlier agreements of peace. Behind the outbreak of war, he says, lay the presence at the Byzantine court of Almos, the brother of the Hungarian king Stephen. Almos had fled and had been welcomed by the emperor, which deeply offended the Hungarian ruler. A more public excuse was also given. According to the Hungarians, traders from their kingdom had been attacked and robbed at Braničevo, and their mistreatment was used to justify retaliation. Choniates presents John as reacting with care rather than haste. While staying at Philippopolis, the emperor considered the matter seriously, prepared his forces and planned a response. Then, he launched a coordinated offensive by land and water. Ships moved swiftly up the Danube from the Black Sea, while the army advanced alongside them. John crossed the river, and once on the far bank his cavalry shattered the Hungarian forces. Choniates lingers on the emperor's endurance, describing him as pressing deep into enemy lands, taking Frango-Chorion between the Sava and the Danube, capturing Semlin and attacking Haram as well. The impression is one of complete success. The emperor punishes the invader, carries the war into hostile territory, and then, after further fighting, dictates peace from a position of strength. This image fits perfectly with the language of court praise that surrounded John. Byzantine panegyrists like to emphasize his toughness, his restraint, and his ability to endure hardship. Yet even within that glowing description there is no real sign that John intended to keep lands north of the Danube or turn the war into a permanent struggle for expansion. His real priorities lay elsewhere. The eastern frontier mattered far more to him than prolonged conflict in the Balkans. In that sense, Choniates presents the Hungarian War not as a major turning point, but as a contained show of force. The emperor punishes aggression, proves his power, secures terms, and moves on. Cinemus tells the story very differently. His version weakens John at almost every stage. Where Choniates shows careful planning, Cinemus suggests alarm and haste. John is made to appear shaken by the Hungarian assault and driven into action without composure. Cinemus also stresses that when the emperor arrived near the Danube, the Hungarian king himself was nowhere to be seen, implying that John found no worthy opponent to confront. The decisive early success is not attributed to John's own leadership, but to Lombard and Turkish mercenaries. Even the capture of Haram is diminished, since the fortress is said to have fallen without real resistance. After this, John supposedly recrossed the river rather than pressing his advantage and only left a garrison behind at Braničevo under a commander named Curtisius. Cinemus alone adds a second stage to the war, set shortly after the first campaign, when the Hungarians attacked Braničevo again. In this part of the story, John comes off even worse. Instead of meeting the crisis with energy, he is shown humiliating Curtisius, despite the commander's brave defense of the fortress. Cinemus then wanders into another example, involving the fortress of Ras, introducing a separate case in which John also treated a military officer harshly. The message is plain. John is not being shown as a steady and inspiring ruler, but as a suspicious and resentful one, the sort of man who dishonours loyal subordinates. Cinemus even hints that such behaviour was criticised at the time. The story then turns openly humiliating. Because the emperor wasted time and weakened morale, the Hungarians regained confidence. The Byzantine troops were cold, poorly supplied, and discouraged. A fresh Hungarian assault followed, and John was supposedly saved only because a Latin woman warned him of the danger. He then fled through a pass known as the Evil Stairs, while the enemy pursued him, and in the chaos even the imperial tent was lost. Taken together, the tone of Cinemus is unmistakable. John is drawn as a fearful, spiteful, lesser emperor. The reason is not difficult to see. Cinemus was writing under the shadow of Manuel's reputation and wanted the father to appear limited so that the son could seem magnificent by contrast. Manuel fought repeatedly in the same frontier zone, around Branicevo and in Frangochorion, and Cinemus consistently portrays him as the embodiment of military kingship, personally courageous, generous to his soldiers, and decisive in war. By lowering John, he raises Manuel. The Hungarian campaigns therefore become part of a larger literary strategy rather than a neutral record. Fortunately, there is also a non-Byzantine version of the war preserved in the Hungarian tradition, and this offers a valuable counterpoint. In that narrative, the conflict begins before the invasion itself, with a provocative claim supposedly made in Constantinople by the Empress Piroska, who was herself of Hungarian royal blood. She is said to have sent word to King Stephen that he was in some sense subordinate to her. Even the emperor, the story says, rebuked her for speaking so boldly. When Stephen heard of it, he took it as a profound insult and reacted with fury. The chronicle then turns dramatic and celebratory in its description of the Hungarian king. He is shown as terrifying in war, devastating Byzantine lands, reducing cities with fire and sword, and inspiring fear everywhere. His name alone, the chronicler says, was enough to silence crying children. The tone is heroic and exaggerated, but it preserves important details beneath the ornament. According to this account, Stephen had with him several hundred Frankish troops, and with their help he damaged the walls of Byzantine strongholds in Bulgaria. When the emperor did not come out to meet him, Stephen sent a taunt, saying that such a man was unworthy even of the name of king and should be called no more than a miserable old midwife. The emperor is then given a sharp answer, promising that Stephen would soon know what sort of midwife he faced when his pride was cut down. After this exchange, the Byzantine response began in earnest. A large imperial force moved against Hungary and crossed near Haram. The Hungarian defenders could not stop them because the Byzantine fleet used Greek fire to destroy their ships. That detail is especially striking because it agrees closely with the stronger parts of the Byzantine version. The river fleet clearly mattered. Control of the Danube was central to the campaign, and the use of incendiary weapons appears to have played a decisive role in the first major reversal suffered by the Hungarians. The Hungarian Chronicle then describes a bloody battle near the river Karas, opposite Branicevo. There, the Hungarian army under one of the king's commanders met the Byzantines in open combat. The result was catastrophic for the Hungarians. The slaughter is described in vivid and almost apocalyptic language. Corpses clogged the river, the water seemed to run red, and men tried to escape by crossing over the bodies of the dead. The scene is clearly stylized, but the underlying point is unmistakable. The Byzantines won a major battle on Hungarian ground. The losses were severe enough to force a change in tone. After that, the emperor and king entered negotiations through trusted envoys and eventually reached a firm peace. This version, despite its dramatic colour, supports the essentials of Choniates far more than those of Cinemus. John did not rush north in panic. He delayed long enough to prepare his response. The Danube fleet was crucial. The fighting beyond the river produced a substantial Byzantine success, and the war ended not in imperial humiliation, but in a settlement favourable enough for the emperor to disengage with his authority intact. That does not mean the campaign transformed the political balance forever, nor does it prove that John saw Hungary as his greatest concern. Quite the opposite. The very way the war ended suggests that he wanted the matter settled, not expanded. That is the key point. The conflicts of 1127 to 1129 are unusually well documented, compared with most episodes from John's reign, but they should not be mistaken for evidence that he considered Hungary the chief danger to the empire. The northern Balkans were not where he intended to spend his strength. However valuable the Adriatic cities might have been, and however active Venice and Hungary were in pressing against Byzantine influence, John did not treat that frontier as the main theatre of his rule. Once peace had been arranged, it held. For the rest of his reign, the agreement with Hungary remained in force. The wider diplomatic setting also helped keep the northern frontier stable. Hungary stood between Byzantium and the German world, and John's good relations with the Western emperors made a major crisis there less likely. He maintained sound ties with Lothar III and later with Conrad III. In 1136, Byzantine troops even took part in Lothar's campaign in southern Italy against Norman power, pushing as far as Bari. Relations with Conrad became closer still, and plans were made to reinforce them through marriage. From 1140 onward, John's fourth son, Manuel, was set to marry Bertha of Sulzbach, linking the Byzantine dynasty more firmly to the German court. All of this allowed John to direct his real energy where he had always intended, toward the eastern frontier. That was where his ambitions lay, and where he devoted the greater part of his resources. His reign ended not in the Balkans or along the Danube, but in Cilicia, where he suffered a fatal hunting accident in 1143. By then, the succession had become more complicated than expected. Two of his sons had already died, leaving Isaac and Manuel as the surviving contenders. The throne was disputed, but in the end, Manuel prevailed. In that outcome, the patterns already visible in the way later writers treated John became even more significant. His memory would be filtered through the reign that followed, and much of what survives about him would be shaped not by his own priorities, but by the needs of those who wrote in the age of his son. Between 1081 and 1143, the rise of Western powers changed the balance along Byzantium's Balkan frontier. The Normans and the Crusaders could be contained when necessary, but the steady expansion of Hungary and Venice was another matter. Alexius I paid far more attention to regions such as Peristrion and Dyrrachium than to the northwestern Balkans. As long as Venice and Hungary remained useful allies, he tolerated their growing hold over places like Dalmatia and Sirmium. His policy was less a fixed strategy than a constant act of balance. Whenever one side seemed to be gaining too much influence, he leaned toward the other. This prevented neither power from pursuing its own ambitions. After an early period of cooperation, both Venice and Hungary increasingly acted in their own interests, and with limited regard for Byzantine priorities. John II largely followed the same approach. His focus remained in the east, and his appearances in the Balkans were brief demonstrations of force rather than signs of long-term commitment. Within the limits he set for himself, those interventions were effective. Even so, the written record is shaped by later Byzantine authors, who had their own political and literary goals, which makes his actions harder to judge clearly. By the time John died in 1143, Venice had secured control over the northern Adriatic, by land and sea. Hungary had pushed further into Sirmium and into the Slavic lands of the northern Balkans, while also gaining recognition in central Dalmatian cities such as Šibenik, Trogir, and Split. John did nothing directly to reverse these developments. He seems to have accepted that direct control over Dalmatia offered little advantage, provided the frontier remained stable. Yet this policy left behind a web of competing loyalties and overlapping claims, a situation that his son Manuel would no longer be willing to ignore. At the beginning of Manuel's reign, there was no immediate break with his father's priorities. Like John, he remained deeply engaged with the eastern frontier. The Crusader states, and especially Antioch, continued to matter. He also tolerated stronger Hungarian influence in Sirmium and the northern Balkans, as well as Venetian control over Dalmatia. But the western situation was becoming harder to manage. The balance John had tried to preserve between the empire and the leading powers of Latin Christendom was beginning to collapse. The broader alliance with Germany no longer suited the new realities, and Western intervention in the east was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming immediate. Under Alexius, imperial policy in the west had been designed in part to shape events farther east. Under Manuel, the danger looked different. Latin interests were no longer separate pressures coming from different directions. They were increasingly converging, and Byzantium was beginning to feel surrounded. One of the clearest examples of this changing world was Manuel's marriage to Bertha of Sulzbach. John II had maintained good relations with the German ruler, Conrad III, and the tone of their surviving exchanges suggests genuine political understanding beneath the formal flattery. Each side expected favours from the other. Conrad wanted help in dealing with problems involving Germans and Russians, indulgence for German mercenaries living in Constantinople, and support for the German community there. John responded positively and spoke of Conrad as a kinsman and a friend. The language of kinship was not empty. From 1140 onward, that friendship was meant to be sealed by the marriage of John's fourth son, Manuel, to Conrad's sister-in-law, Bertha. The arrangement was designed above all to strengthen a common front against Roger II of Sicily, the Norman ruler whose growing power threatened both empires. Behind this alliance stood an even larger vision. Both the German and Byzantine courts imagined a future settlement in Italy, made without reference to the papacy. Conrad would be recognised in Lombardy, and Byzantium would recover influence in Apulia, lands that had once belonged to the empire and still contained many Greek-speaking Orthodox communities. The plan amounted to a proposed division of Italy between the two great imperial powers. For the moment, though, it remained a future possibility. Conrad was occupied by domestic troubles, while John continued to focus on campaigns in the east. Then, in 1143, while hunting in Cilicia, John died. Manuel, who had been with the army and held command at the crucial moment, secured the throne. Once emperor, Manuel continued the alliance with Germany, because it still served a major purpose: the containment of Norman power. He exchanged embassies and gifts with Conrad and sought to renew the anti-Norman understanding that had existed under his father. But Manuel was no longer just a younger prince following a marriage plan arranged for him by others. As emperor, he wanted a wife more suited to his new status. Bertha had already been in Constantinople for some time, and her qualities were well known. Some praised her noble connections and moral seriousness. Others noticed that she was plain in appearance, austere in manner, and firm in her opinions. Manuel himself was young, energetic, and drawn toward pleasure, display, and more glamorous possibilities. At one point, he even explored the chance of a Norman marriage instead. That changed in January 1146, when he married Bertha after all, and with unusual haste considering how long she'd already been present in the capital. The reason was political. Manuel had recommitted himself to the German alliance against Roger of Sicily, but he also had a second concern that was becoming more urgent with every passing month. A new crusade was taking shape in the Latin West, and he wanted to keep Conrad III from joining it. The fall of Edessa in 1144 had sent shockwaves through the Crusader world. Discussions began quickly in the Levant about calling for a new armed expedition, and envoys were sent west to seek papal backing. Manuel could not have been unaware of what this might mean. He was already involved in affairs connected to Antioch and Edessa, and he had his own reasons to worry about large Western armies crossing Byzantine territory. The memory of the First Crusade and its chaos had not faded. In the autumn of 1145, while these plans were taking shape in the west, a Byzantine envoy named Nicephorus visited Conrad's court. The surviving account of that embassy suggests a tense and difficult exchange. Manuel appears to have tried to reopen the marriage question and press for a different bride, angering Conrad deeply. Only after several days of pressure and negotiation did the Byzantine side accept the original arrangement. In return, Manuel gained a stronger commitment from the German ruler. Conrad promised military support and, if necessary, even personal assistance. The deeper purpose behind these negotiations seems clear. Manuel wanted Conrad to remain in the west and stay out of any crusading enterprise aimed at the east. In effect, he was trying to secure the German alliance not just against the Normans, but also against the possibility of another uncontrolled Western expedition through Byzantine lands. At first, this may not have seemed unrealistic. Conrad had serious problems at home. There was unrest in several parts of Germany, conflict in neighbouring regions, and pressure along the Hungarian frontier. The Pope was not yet enthusiastic about a crusade, and other options were being discussed, including campaigns against pagan Slavs in northeastern Europe. Manuel may well have judged that Conrad had neither the freedom nor the immediate desire to march east. Yet the Byzantine emperor could not afford to take chances. Losing his most important Western ally would have been dangerous enough. Seeing that ally lead a massive armed pilgrimage through imperial territory would have been worse. Stories from the First Crusade, combined with memories of Western pilgrims passing through the empire in later years, would have made the risk seem very real. Manuel therefore treated the marriage to Bertha as a necessary political sacrifice. Once that alliance had been secured, he moved east against the Seljuk ruler Masud. Byzantine forces advanced successfully and reached deep into central Anatolia, pushing toward Philomelium and then Iconium. But Manuel was not prepared for a long siege. His campaign was intended more as a display of strength than as a full conquest, and it was cut short by growing reports that Western armies were gathering and would soon descend on Byzantine territory in great force. Manuel returned to Constantinople to prepare for what was coming. By this stage, he was closely monitoring Western developments. Letters sent to Pope Eugenius III show that he understood the Pope's role in proclaiming and attempting to direct the crusade. In one letter written in the summer of 1146, Manuel welcomed the news of the expedition and promised that the King of France and his followers would be received, provisioned, and allowed to pass through imperial territory. But he demanded something in return. He wanted the same honour earlier crusade leaders had granted his grandfather Alexius. That meant oaths of loyalty and formal recognition of imperial authority. In a later letter, written when the expedition was much closer, Manuel was even more explicit. The Crusaders were to swear in advance that they would do no harm to imperial lands and would return any cities once belonging to the empire. He also wanted papal authority used to restrain their behaviour, even suggesting that a papal representative accompany them. These demands show that Byzantium understood very well how the crusading movement worked, both spiritually and politically, and that Manuel was determined to keep control of the situation before the armies even arrived. His concern was not only with the French. The real shock came when Conrad III himself decided to take the cross and lead the German contingent in the Second Crusade. That choice, encouraged by the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, overturn the assumptions on which Manuel had built his policy. Contemporary Byzantine voices make it clear that the emperor had not expected this. He was thrown into confusion, but he did not remain passive. He took defensive measures at once. Later, writers accused him of dealing dishonestly with the Germans, spreading stories that bad grain had been sold to them, or that debased coinage had been used in transactions with the Crusaders. Whether true or not, such rumours show how bitter the atmosphere became. Manuel's enemies at home and abroad had plenty of material with which to attack him. As the Germans crossed Thrace, there were small clashes at places like Philippopolis and Adrianople. Tension between the locals and the Crusaders remained high. Then came the disaster at Koirobakoi. The German army camped in a broad plain through which a shallow stream called the Melas usually ran quietly. But after heavy rains, that stream became a violent torrent and tore straight through the camp. Men, animals, equipment, and supplies were swept away. The scene was devastating. Some Byzantine writers described it with a degree of pity, seeing mighty warriors struck down not by enemies, but by nature itself. Others were far harsher and treated the flood almost as divine punishment for Western arrogance and bad faith. Some court rhetoric openly compared Conrad to Pharaoh and the Germans to enemies destroyed by waters sent from above. Latin writers also treated the event as a sign of divine judgment, though with different emphases, sometimes using it to highlight the special favour shown to particular leaders who escaped unharmed. Byzantine accounts also tied the flood to the issue of oaths. According to one version, Manuel's envoys had already met the Crusade leaders near the imperial frontier and extracted promises that Byzantine territory would not be harmed. When conflicts later broke out, the flood was interpreted as heaven's answer to those broken promises. Whatever the rhetoric, the scale of the disaster was real. The German army, already under strain, was badly shaken before it ever reached Constantinople. When the Germans finally appeared before the capital, fear inside the city was intense. Large Western armies at the gates of Constantinople were never viewed calmly. Manuel responded with careful preparation. The land walls were repaired and strengthened, especially near the northern sector close to the imperial residence at Blachernae. The renewed fortifications were decorated and displayed proudly, transforming the walls into both a military barrier and a political statement. The emperor wanted the city to look strong, orderly, and fully prepared. Another fortified point on the Bosphorus may have been improved at the same time in order to oversee the transfer of Crusaders into Asia. The public response was a mixture of anxiety and relief. The Western armies were dangerous while on Byzantine soil, and many in the capital were grateful simply to see them ferried across the straits. Yet Manuel's troubles were only beginning. While the Germans were moving through the empire and the alliance with Germany was effectively suspended, Roger II of Sicily struck hard. In the summer of 1147, Norman forces seized Corfu and raided deep into Byzantine territory, capturing Thebes and Corinth and carrying off plunder and prisoners back to Sicily. The humiliation was severe. Even worse, the Normans kept hold of Corfu, a position of enormous strategic value at the entrance to the Adriatic. From there, they could threaten routes vital to both Byzantium and Venice. Manuel could not tolerate that. Like Alexius before him, he turned to Venice for naval help. In October 1147, he finally confirmed the commercial privileges Venice had long sought. The Venetians readily cooperated because Norman control of Corfu endangered their own shipping routes and threatened their wider commercial system. At the same time, the crusade itself was falling apart. The Germans had not brought enough provisions for Anatolia and had expected to live off the land, but winter conditions and Turkish resistance made that impossible. Their attempt to cross the plateau ended badly, and retreat followed. The French and other contingents fared little better. They moved south under constant pressure, and eventually Louis VII received Byzantine help to continue by sea. Conrad, exhausted and frustrated, returned to Constantinople, where Manuel received him with great ceremony before arranging transport onward. After the failed attack on Damascus, Conrad came back again, and this time the two emperors met at Thessalonica. The agreement they reached there in 1148 helped rebuild trust after the disruption caused by the Crusade. Earlier arrangements between Byzantium and Germany had been mostly defensive, aimed at containing the Normans while allowing each ruler to focus elsewhere. The new understanding went further. It explicitly planned a joint offensive against Norman Sicily and set out, at least in outline, how Italy would be divided if victory came. Manuel pushed his claim to Apulia and Calabria, regions once ruled by Byzantium and still marked by Greek language and Orthodox traditions. Conrad accepted this, while Manuel recognized Conrad's interests in Lombardy. Both sides framed the arrangement in imperial language. Each still saw himself as the rightful Roman emperor, so every concession had to be presented carefully. For Manuel, recovering southern Italy could be described as restoration. For Conrad, allowing Byzantine claims, there could be presented not as surrender, but as a dynastic gift connected to Bertha's marriage. This renewed alliance was strengthened further by another marriage, this time between Manuel's niece Theodora and Henry Jasomirgott, a major German prince. The treaty was not merely symbolic, it was put into action almost at once. German troops joined the Byzantine effort to recover Corfu, and in July 1149 the island's citadel was retaken. A German garrison was left there, and Manuel moved on to the Adriatic coast to plan a wider attack on Sicily. But once again events in the Balkans disrupted his plans. Conrad was drawn back by problems in Germany and could not fully support the offensive. Manuel, meanwhile, was confronted by a serious uprising in the Serbian lands of Raška. In 1149, as he was preparing to strike at Norman positions in southern Italy, Manuel learned that the Serbs of Raška had rebelled. He marched north and moved quickly. The fortress of Ras was recovered, and archaeological traces still point to violent damage and rebuilding from this period. From there, he pushed further into the region, capturing strongholds and subduing territory connected to the Serbian ruler. The key fortress of Galach also fell, and many captives were taken and resettled in other parts of the empire. Yet the main Serbian leader, Uroš II, escaped. Contemporary Byzantine praise poetry presents the revolt in highly dramatic language, but also reveals its broader context. The Serbs had not acted alone. They were encouraged by Hungarian support and by Norman diplomacy. Roger II had every reason to stir trouble in the Balkans if it distracted Manuel from Italy, and the Hungarian connection marked a serious change after years of relative stability. Manuel understood that one campaign would not be enough. In 1150 he returned to face the problem directly. This time the Serbs and Hungarians were acting together. According to Byzantine accounts, Hungarian troops had been sent in support of the Serbian cause through a family connection linking the Serbian ruler to the Hungarian court. Before they could unite fully with the Serbs, Byzantine forces intercepted them. The retreat that followed did not move northward back toward Hungary, but deeper south into rougher territory, suggesting that the Hungarian contingent was trying to reach its Serbian allies in the interior. Manuel advanced from the region near Niš and decided to force battle before the alliance could solidify. The confrontation came at Tara. There, the emperor encountered not just Serbian resistance, but a large combined force that included Hungarian cavalry and other allied groups. The fighting was hard and personal. Byzantine writers emphasized acts of bravery by leading officers and by Manuel himself, turning the battle into a vivid display of imperial courage. One version has him striking down numerous enemies with his lance, while another highlights the duel with the Hungarian commander as the decisive moment of victory. Beneath the heroic detail, the outcome was clear. The Byzantine army won. Afterward, the Serbian ruler submitted and swore loyalty to the emperor, abandoning the alliance with both Hungary and the Normans. In the first half of the 12th century, Dalmatia became a contested space where two rising powers, Venice and Hungary, competed for influence. The Byzantine emperors Alexius I and John II watched these developments, without attempting to stop them. Instead, they tolerated the growing presence of both powers, occasionally encouraging rivalry between them and supporting whichever side best suited imperial interests at the time. Hungarian authority also spread among the southern Slavic lands, where local rulers increasingly accepted the Hungarian king's influence. After 1105, the ruler of Hungary had taken the title of King of the Croats, a move that likely received quiet acceptance from Byzantium, especially after dynastic ties had been strengthened through marriage. From there, Hungarian power pushed further south and east, reaching into regions such as Rashka and Bosna. The exact process by which Bosna came under Hungarian influence remains unclear, but it appears to have been secured by the late 1130s, possibly through political agreements and marriage alliances. The Hungarian king, Bela II, married into the Serbian ruling family, binding the interests of Hungary and Rashka more closely together. This connection was not symbolic. Leaders from Bosna later joined Hungarian campaigns, showing that their loyalty had real military value. Around the early 1140s, Hungarian forces returned in strength to central Dalmatia and regained control over important cities, including Šibenik, Trogir, and Split. Some historians have suggested that this Hungarian expansion may have begun earlier, possibly in the 1130s, but the evidence is uncertain. The argument rests on fragmentary records and later copies of documents, some of which are known to be unreliable. Titles claimed by Hungarian kings in these texts may have been altered by later scribes, making it difficult to establish a precise timeline. What can be said with confidence is that, by the early 1140s, Hungarian authority in central Dalmatia had become a reality. Venice responded in its own way and not always through direct military force. When Dubrovnik was attacked by forces from Bosna, the Venetians sent troops, but instead of defending the city, they turned to plunder. The inhabitants drove them out, and from that point onward, Dubrovnik remained outside direct Venetian control. Elsewhere, however, Venice used a more subtle approach. The Doge worked through the church, securing papal support to weaken Hungarian influence. New bishoprics were established on nearby islands to challenge pro-Hungarian clergy on the mainland. By reorganizing ecclesiastical authority, Venice reshaped political control without relying solely on armies. At the same time, Venice strengthened its position across the northern Adriatic. Treaties were signed with cities along the Italian coast and in Istria, creating a defensive network designed to protect Venetian interests. These agreements defined a sphere of influence, stretching from Ancona in Italy to Dubrovnik on the eastern shore. In effect, the northern Adriatic was treated as a Venetian-controlled space. When some of these cities later broke their agreements, Venice responded forcefully, imposing tribute and demanding loyalty. Former allies were transformed into subjects. The rise of Norman Sicily added another layer of tension. Roger II expanded his power northward in Italy, threatening both Byzantine and Venetian interests. In response, Venice sought agreements that would stabilize the situation. By the mid-12th century, Venice and the Norman kingdom had reached an understanding, dividing their areas of influence in the Adriatic. This arrangement further reduced Byzantine influence in the region, leaving the empire increasingly isolated from the Western maritime world. Meanwhile, relations between Byzantium and Venice began to deteriorate. When Manuel I granted trade privileges to Genoa, Venice's major rival, the Venetians reacted sharply. They withdrew traditional support for Byzantine campaigns and took steps to assert direct control over Dalmatian cities. For the first time, Venetian rulers began placing their own family members in positions of power in these cities, bypassing local traditions. In places like Zadar, Venetian authority was imposed more openly, and the citizens were required to swear formal loyalty to Venice and its leadership. These oaths made no reference to Byzantine authority, effectively erasing any remaining imperial claims in the region. At the same time, tensions between Byzantium and Hungary intensified, though not always in the way earlier historians imagined. The period between 1150 and 1155 was once thought to be a time of constant warfare, driven by Manuel's desire to conquer Hungary. A closer look suggests something different. The conflicts were brief, limited, and often more about pressure and display than full-scale war. After defeating Serbian forces at Tara, Manuel quickly turned his attention to Hungary. His goal was not conquest, but punishment. The Hungarian king Ajeza II had supported the Serbian uprising, and Manuel wanted to send a clear message. Moving swiftly, he launched a campaign into Hungarian territory, devastating the frontier region between the Sava and the Danube. Thousands of captives were taken, and entire areas were stripped of resources. Yet before advancing further, Manuel sent a message to Ajeza, effectively inviting him to return and face him. This was not the action of a ruler seeking annexation. It was a calculated demonstration of strength designed to force negotiation. Manuel even attempted to provoke a decisive battle by sending a Hungarian claimant under his protection to raid the region repeatedly. Ajeza, however, refused to be drawn into a direct confrontation. He understood that even a victory would leave him weakened, while a defeat could be catastrophic. Instead, he chose to negotiate. Manuel returned to Constantinople with his objectives achieved. He had inflicted damage, taken prisoners, and forced Hungary into a defensive position. Celebrations followed, and court poets described the campaign in grand and exaggerated terms. They spoke of rivers filled with bodies and victories that came one after another like waves. The emperor was praised as a conqueror who had achieved multiple triumphs in a single season. Yet behind the rhetoric, the reality was more restrained. Manuel had not expanded the empire. He had secured his frontier and demonstrated his power. Ajeza soon attempted a response, but Manuel reacted just as quickly. Once again, the conflict ended in negotiation rather than escalation. The emperor returned most of the prisoners, keeping only a portion as leverage. Stability along the frontier was more valuable than total victory, especially since Manuel's attention was increasingly focused elsewhere, particularly on plans for action against Norman Sicily. For a time, peace held. Hungary was occupied with its own concerns, including involvement in the politics of the Russian lands. The situation changed again in the early 1150s, when new pressures emerged from the west. A new German ruler, Frederick Barbarossa, promised renewed cooperation with Byzantium and expressed interest in joint operations against the Normans. Diplomatic exchanges suggested that a major campaign in Italy might soon take place, supported by both empires. This placed Hungary in a difficult position. Surrounded by powerful neighbours, it could not afford to lose its alliances. The Normans, as a naval power, were especially important to Hungarian interests in Dalmatia. When Hungarian forces moved again toward the Danube, the action appears to have been more symbolic than strategic. Negotiations followed quickly, and peace was restored before any major conflict developed. The entire episode seems to have been a display meant to satisfy political obligations, rather than a genuine attempt at war. Manuel, confident that the situation was under control, shifted his attention southward. He positioned himself in the Balkans not as a defender against Hungary, but as a ruler preparing for campaigns elsewhere. His actions suggest that he did not see Hungary as his main concern. Even the appointment of officials in the frontier regions reflects this confidence. That confidence, however, proved misplaced. Internal intrigue disrupted the balance. A member of the imperial family sought support from Hungary in a bid to overthrow Manuel. Promises were made, alliances formed, and the situation escalated into a new crisis. Hungarian forces moved once again toward Byzantine territory, this time on a much larger scale. Manuel was not fully prepared for the size of the army assembled against him. Instead of rushing into battle, he used deception. A message was deliberately sent ahead, falling into Hungarian hands and convincing them that the emperor was approaching with full force. Believing they had lost the advantage, the Hungarian army withdrew before a decisive clash could occur. Even so, smaller engagements followed, with mixed results depending on the source. Some accounts emphasize setbacks, while others describe victories. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Once again, the conflict ended not with conquest, but with negotiation. By early 1155, peace had been restored on terms similar to those agreed in earlier years. The pattern repeated itself. Short bursts of conflict, followed by settlements that preserved the overall balance. Despite their limited military significance, these campaigns were transformed into grand victories through imperial propaganda. Court poets and speakers depicted the Danube as a boundary between civilization and chaos, with the emperor crossing it as a heroic act. The Hungarians were portrayed not as a neighbouring kingdom, but as ancient enemies reborn under new names. Victories were magnified, enemies diminished, and the emperor elevated above both history and myth. Public celebrations reinforced this image. Prisoners were displayed in carefully staged processions, dressed in rich clothing to enhance the spectacle. They were arranged in groups to appear more numerous than they really were. The goal was not accuracy, but impression. The emperor was presented as a conqueror, a ruler whose victories extended the reach of the empire and restored its glory. This image served an important purpose. Manuel was still consolidating his power, and military success, even when exaggerated, helped secure his position. He was portrayed not just as a strategist, but as a warrior who fought alongside his soldiers and shared their risks. This was a powerful image in a society that valued strength and leadership. Yet beneath the display, a deeper shift was taking place. The events of these years showed that earlier policies had failed. Allowing Hungary and Venice to expand unchecked had created long-term problems. The alliance with Germany had proven unreliable. Even carefully planned agreements could collapse under pressure, as seen during the Second Crusade. At the same time, the empire faced setbacks elsewhere. Byzantine efforts in southern Italy initially showed promise, with local support and early successes. Cities surrendered and advances were made. But without strong naval support, these gains could not be sustained. A decisive defeat followed, and Byzantine commanders were captured. In the end, Manuel was forced to recognize the Norman ruler as King of Sicily and abandon his claims in the region. The clashes between Byzantium and Hungary in the years from 1150 to 1155 were not as savage or unrelenting as older interpretations once claimed. Yet, they still had serious consequences for the political order of the northwestern Balkans. In Rashka and along the frontier zone beyond the imperial heartland, even limited warfare was enough to upset a delicate balance. This instability was not simply the result of local Jupans changing sides whenever it suited them. Something deeper had changed. Over many years, through neglect rather than sudden collapse, Byzantium had allowed a new balance of power to emerge in the region. Under Alexius I, then under John II, and even during the first years of Manuel I, the empire had failed to reassert itself decisively in the northwest. Hungary and Venice had both pushed into lands and relationships that had once belonged more securely within the Byzantine sphere. For local rulers, that meant new patrons, new sources of protection, and new ways to escape dependence on Constantinople. While Byzantium and Germany still imagined themselves as the two great imperial forces of Europe, there had been a tendency to treat these smaller powers as manageable pieces on a larger board. If necessary, they could be disciplined. If useful, they could be guided. But the continuing Norman threat forced a reconsideration of that confidence. By the time Manuel fully grasped the scale of the problem, Byzantine influence had already faded badly in the Dalmatian ports and in the Slavic lands lying north of Duclia and Zeta. Then, between 1156 and 1160, the wider diplomatic structure that had seemed to support Byzantine security began to come apart. The understanding with Germany weakened and then turned into something far colder. The reasons were many, but much centred on the unexpected turn of events in southern Italy. Byzantine agents had achieved striking success there in 1155, enough to alarm other powers. Yet before the Normans recovered the initiative, Frederick Barbarossa had already come to terms with the papacy in a way that effectively excluded Byzantine territorial ambitions in Italy. When a Byzantine embassy later arrived to discuss both strategy and a proposed dynastic marriage, Frederick delayed for weeks. During that delay, he married Beatrice of Burgundy, then learned of the crushing Byzantine defeat at Brindisi. From that moment onward, the old partnership no longer looked like a firm alliance. It became something more suspicious and competitive. Italy and Hungary now turned into contested spaces where the two empires measured each other, tested each other, and occasionally compromised, but no longer trusted one another. These shifts forced Manuel to rethink the entire structure of the northwestern frontier. His answer was not only diplomatic, it was physical, military, and highly visible. Between 1156 and 1160, he moved to restore, strengthen, and garrison key fortresses along the Danube, especially at Belgrade and Braničevo. The need for such work had already been exposed in earlier years. In 1154, when one faction in Belgrade appeared ready to rebel, a trusted commander had to be sent in to break the movement before it spread. Belgrade could not be allowed to slip away. Together with Braničevo, it formed the outer shield of the empire in this region. Its old late Roman walls, restored centuries earlier, enclosed a broad space but were no longer suited to the realities of 12th century war. A huge defensive circuit was difficult to man, too exposed and too vulnerable when the defenders were few. Earlier, crises had already shown this. When the Crusaders passed through in 1096, the local commander had not even tried to hold the place properly and had fallen back toward Niš. The Hungarian attack of 1127 only confirmed how hard it was to defend those long, decaying earthworks. By the mid-12th century, Belgrade was still important, but its old shape was obsolete. So a new fortress was built within the older enclosure, placed in the northwestern corner on high ground above the Danube. It was smaller, harder, more compact, and designed for a different kind of control. The river had shifted enough to expose a settled area below, and there were clear signs of life continuing both within and around the old walls. Yet the new stronghold was not built to shelter that population. In fact, it seems to have been separated from it and, if necessary, defensible against it. A deep ditch ran along the southern side. The main gate did not open naturally toward the town, but toward the slope leading down to the river. That detail matters. The fortress was oriented toward communication with Branicevo and the wider empire by water, not toward everyday integration with the local community. It functioned as an imperial military post, a platform from which officers could watch the population, police the region, and keep an eye on the lands beyond the frontier. It was a statement in stone. The empire was returning, but not through old forms of local partnership. It was returning through direct military oversight. Archaeology supports this picture. The material found inside the new Belgrade fortress points overwhelmingly to the 12th century, and the style of its construction fits the building habits associated with Manuel's reign. Decorative stonework, brick bands, and carefully finished visible sections gave the fortress an impressive exterior, especially on the side, most visible from the plain, the river, and the Hungarian bank across the Danube. Less exposed areas were more practical, built from rougher material and strengthened with thick lime mortar. The design was not only functional, it was meant to be seen. The western walls stood above the river bend like a message to those beyond the frontier. This too matches the way Manuel built elsewhere. His military architecture often combined usefulness with display, especially in places where the visual impact mattered politically. Branicevo, farther east at the meeting point of the Danube and the Mlava, received similar attention. There, the defences consisted of two connected but distinct parts. The smaller and older fortress occupied a strong position on elevated ground above the river, and excavations there have produced material from the Roman period through the 12th century, including an unusually large number of Byzantine lead seals. That alone suggests administrative and military importance. In the mid-12th century, an additional fortified area was laid out beside it, expanding the whole complex dramatically. Yet the relationship between the two spaces was revealing. The older core was not absorbed into a single open settlement. It remained distinct, protected behind its own southern walls and approached through a fortified gate. This resembles what happened at Belgrade. A compact inner stronghold was preserved, while a wider defensive circuit was added around more open ground. That larger outer space was probably not designed as a full urban centre in the normal sense. It looks more like a military assembly ground or operating base for troops stationed on the Danube. Similar arrangements elsewhere in the empire suggest a temporary or semi-permanent staging area rather than a fully developed civilian stronghold. The walls themselves were comparatively simple, and only later improvements strengthened more exposed approaches. There is little reason to attribute this entire construction to John II, as some once did. The argument for that has always been weak. References used to support it fit better with repairs elsewhere, especially at Belgrade. It makes better sense to connect the expansion at Branicevo with the same frontier policy visible under Manuel, especially after 1156. Later evidence suggests that additional strengthening and settlement took place there in the mid-1160s, when Byzantine-Hungarian tensions rose again and the fortress system on the Danube became even more important. But walls alone could not restore imperial control. Manuel also needed to reassert authority over the Serbs of Raška, whose rulers had grown increasingly tied to Hungary and had even looked to Norman Sicily when it suited them. The emperor's task was not only to defeat rebellious subjects, but to make it unmistakably clear to them and to the wider world that political legitimacy in the region still flowed from Constantinople. Before he left the northwest in 1155, and probably already in the autumn of 1154, Manuel intervened in a struggle within the Serbian ruling family. Disa had displaced his brother du Uroš during the turmoil of the previous year. Manuel now stepped in as judge. What followed was more than a political settlement. It was staged as an imperial performance. Foreign envoys were present. The event was meant to be seen, talked about, and remembered. Deza approached the emperor as a suppliant, throwing himself before him in fear and submission. Uroš did the same, asking not merely for mercy, but for the restoration of what he had lost. Manuel presided over the dispute from an elevated seat, presenting himself not simply as a stronger neighbouring ruler, but as the source of rightful order. He restored Uroš to his former position, but he did not crush Deza completely. Instead, Deza was allowed to retain authority over certain lands, though only under clearly defined limits. Manuel drew the boundaries, assigned the shares, and left both brothers dependent on his favour. There was nothing unusual in an emperor confirming lands and titles for subordinate rulers. Such acts had long been part of Byzantine imperial practice. What made this moment different was its timing and its audience. It was carefully shaped to impress not only the Serbs, but also foreign representatives from the Latin world and from the East. Manuel was making a statement about what imperial sovereignty meant. He was demonstrating that rulers might fight, claim, and bargain, but only the emperor could settle, confirm, divide, and legitimize. The scene also echoed comparable acts of arbitration carried out by Frederick Barbarossa elsewhere in Europe. In that sense, the hearing in the Serbian lands was not just local government. It was part of a wider contest between two emperors who were increasingly behaving like rivals, rather than allies. That rivalry soon shifted more openly toward Hungary. Byzantine writers later claimed that Manuel wanted control over Hungary because of its position among the Western kingdoms. That claim needs care, but there is truth in the broader strategic point. Manuel did not seek to absorb the whole kingdom into his empire, nor to place the Hungarian crown permanently on a Byzantine head. What he wanted was more practical and more limited. He wanted a cooperative ruler in Hungary, or at least a ruler who would respect Byzantine interests. Above all, he wanted firm recognition of Byzantine claims over the southern frontier zone, especially the territory known as Frangochorion, the broad region stretching between the Danube, the Sava, and farther westward toward the Drava. Control there would push the imperial frontier outward and give Byzantium strategic depth. The chance came when King Deza II died in late May 1162. He had already arranged for his teenage son to succeed him as Stephen III, and the accession was pushed through quickly by a faction centred in the north of the kingdom and closely aligned with the papacy. Manuel moved at once to challenge that outcome. His preferred candidate was Stephen's uncle, another Stephen, who had married into the imperial family and had an arguable dynastic claim. For Manuel, the calculation was straightforward. If a man tied by marriage to the Komnenian house could take the Hungarian throne, Byzantine influence would rise sharply, and valuable territory in the south might be secured in return. But Hungarian politics were too divided for such a simple solution. The kingdom was split by faction, region, and ecclesiastical sympathy. One group strongly favoured ties with Rome and supported the young Stephen III. Another, stronger in the south and more open to Eastern or mixed influence, was willing to consider alternatives. Byzantine gold and diplomacy helped drive Stephen III from the throne after only a few weeks, yet Manuel's first candidate was seen by many as too openly Byzantine. A compromise emerged in the form of his brother Ladislas. Ladislas too had close ties to Constantinople, but he was more acceptable inside Hungary. Far from representing a setback for Manuel, this arrangement still served his interests. Ladislas was willing to honour the broader understanding with Byzantium, and Stephen, the displaced uncle, was recognised in a special position as designated heir and granted extensive lands in the south. This was no small gain. Through this arrangement, Manuel obtained influence over a large region beyond the Danube without sending in administrators or trying to rule directly. It also appears that Frederick Barbarossa did not immediately object, which made the compromise easier to accept. But the whole balance collapsed almost at once when Ladislas died in January 1163. Stephen, the imperial candidate, then took the throne himself. His southern power base disappeared with that move, because he had exchanged a secure regional support network for the insecure centre of royal authority, surrounded by magnates who disliked him. At the same time, the broader international implications became sharper. Churchmen in the Latin world feared that his close connection to the Byzantine court would pull Hungary away from Rome. Frederick Barbarossa also grew dissatisfied and began encouraging a coalition in favour of the younger Stephen III. Even the Serbian ruler Deza, now hostile to Byzantine interests, leaned toward that side. The pressure proved too much. After only a few months, Stephen was defeated and driven out. Remarkably, he first turned to Frederick for help, an act that must have greatly alarmed Manuel. Hungarian affairs were now slipping under the influence of his western rival. When Stephen eventually reached Sardica after receiving nothing substantial from the German emperor, Manuel gave him money and troops to try again. But events were moving quickly. Stephen III had regained power only because of outside support, especially from Austria and Bohemia. His mother had worked actively to build alliances, including marriage ties, in order to sustain his cause. Yet those allies were not eager for endless intervention in Hungary. Their willingness had limits. When a Byzantine army approached under one of Manuel's senior commanders, the mere threat was enough to force Stephen III toward negotiations. What followed in 1163 reveals the real limits and real priorities of Byzantine policy. Manuel now saw that his earlier candidate could not hold the Hungarian throne. Rather than wasting strength on an impossible restoration, he shifted to a second plan. He sent an envoy to arrange the betrothal of Stephen III's younger brother Bela to his own daughter. Stephen III, or more likely those guiding him, accepted quickly. Bela was handed over, and with him came rights over the southern territories that had earlier been assigned to him by their father. These lands were not trivial. Bela's duchy included major territories in Dalmatia and Pannonia, lands that had been brought under Hungarian control during the previous century. In the confusion after Geza's death, some of these areas had become contested, and Bela stood to gain by receiving both renewed recognition and Byzantine backing. The exact place of Sirmium in these negotiations is not fully clear, but later developments strongly suggest that Byzantine pressure ensured that the region around Sirmium was added to the arrangement. Manuel had therefore found another route to the same goal. Instead of putting a favoured adult claimant on the whole Hungarian throne, he took hold of a huge southern zone through a younger prince whose future would now be formed in Constantinople. Bela was brought to the capital, given extraordinary honour, renamed Alexius, and styled with a title of exceptional dignity. In effect, he became the centerpiece of a new Byzantine strategy. Manuel did not mean to administer these borderlands directly if he could avoid it. He wanted a native ruler whose fortunes were bound up with his own, a buffer shaped by imperial influence rather than outright annexation. That left the earlier claimant, Stephen, politically unnecessary. But he did not disappear. In the spring of 1164, he returned to Sirmium and quickly found support among many in the local population. Once again, he reached out to Frederick Barbarossa, offering money in exchange for recognition. Stephen III responded by marching against him, and Manuel, though still occupied with plans in the east, was forced back to the Danube. The emperor framed his intervention carefully. He sent word that he had not come to make war on Hungary itself, but to restore Bela's lands and rescue Stephen from danger. That was more than diplomatic language. It reflected the core of his policy. He was prepared to fight hard for the southern marches, for Sirmium, and for Frango-Corian, especially now that he had bound those lands to a marriage alliance involving his own daughter. But he still did not seek total conquest of Hungary. The outcome would depend not just on armies in the field, but on whether Stephen III's allies would stand firm. Here, Manuel used diplomacy with considerable skill. The Bohemian ruler Vladislas had been expected to support Stephen III, but Byzantine envoys reminded him of earlier obligations and persuaded him to mediate, instead of intervene directly. Once Stephen III saw that his ally would not fight openly against the emperor, he had little choice but to accept a settlement. Later, he even sent envoys asking Manuel not to let his uncle wage war in Hungary again. Manuel agreed, but he also left forces north of the Danube under an imperial commander. Those troops occupied Sirmium and Frango-Corian, which were now treated as separate from Hungary and effectively placed under Byzantine protection. Contemporary Byzantine writers could present this outcome as natural and justified, not merely because of diplomacy or force, but because of the population itself. They emphasized that the local people, especially clergy and common folk, received the emperor warmly. The city of Bax was portrayed as the chief center of the people of Sirmium, with its own ecclesiastical structure closely linked to the Eastern Church. Crowds were said to come out in support, and the region was described as one whose inhabitants were largely Orthodox and naturally inclined toward Byzantine rule. Whether this picture was overstated or not, it suited the argument perfectly. Byzantium was not seizing an alien land, but restoring order in a region that could plausibly be represented as culturally and spiritually connected to the empire. By the mid-1160s, then, Manuel had transformed the northern frontier. He had rebuilt fortresses, reasserted the principle of imperial arbitration among the Serbs, intervened decisively in Hungarian succession politics, and secured direct influence over the lands around Sirmium and Frango-Corian. None of this amounted to the conquest of Hungary. That had never been the real goal. What mattered was the creation of a defensible, controllable belt beyond the Danube and the denial of that zone to rival powers, above all, Hungary, Venice, and increasingly Frederick Barbarossa. The neglected frontier of earlier reigns was no longer being left to drift. Under Manuel, it was becoming one of the central arenas in which imperial power would now be asserted. Manuel's decision to continue backing the deposed Stephen even after the agreement of 1164 has often been taken as proof that he wanted to conquer all of Hungary. In reality, it reflected something much narrower and much more practical. Stephen still mattered in the lands south of the Hungarian core, above all in Sirmium, Frango-Corian, and the region around Bax. Every time he entered those territories, support gathered around him with surprising ease. Manuel understood that this local strength could still be useful. As long as Stephen remained influential there, he offered the emperor a familiar and effective way to hold the southern marches. Manuel even tried to convince him that his appeal did not extend much farther north. At one point, he staged an elaborate deception using another Arpad prince, also named Stephen, who resembled him closely. This younger man was sent into Hungary with a band of mercenaries, only to be handed over immediately to Stephen III. The performance was meant to show that the old pretender no longer had a future beyond the south. But Stephen was not persuaded. He continued to believe that his support in the southern lands could still be turned into a route back to the throne. Manuel could not allow him to drift once more toward Frederick Barbarossa in search of help. That would have endangered everything Byzantium had gained in Sirmium. So the emperor's continued support for Stephen was not blind stubbornness. It was the unavoidable price of trying to keep that frontier region under control. Yet this same policy also made any lasting settlement with Stephen III extremely difficult. In the spring of 1165, the Hungarian king invaded Sirmium again, and only then did Manuel begin to consider a more radical solution, one he had not previously intended: restoring Stephen to the Hungarian throne. Before he could act, another danger intervened. Manuel was distracted by a fresh rebellion involving his cousin Andronicus Comnenus, the same man who would one day seize the imperial crown. While the emperor was occupied, Stephen III moved quickly. He advanced against Semlin, the strong fortress within the Byzantine sphere where his uncle had taken refuge. There he found allies inside the city, willing to act for him. Stephen was murdered, and with his death the last serious rallying point for resistance in that part of the country disappeared. The effect was immediate. Sirmium, which Byzantium had worked so carefully to detach from Hungary, slipped back under Hungarian authority. At the same time, Stephen III regained much of Dalmatia as well. Earlier, while seeking Venetian support against his uncle, he had cultivated good relations with the Doge and had promised to step back from cities such as Split, Trogir, and Šibenik. He also strengthened that relationship through marriage ties involving one of his leading nobles and the Doge's family. But once his position improved, Stephen ignored those understandings. He returned in force to central Dalmatia and inspired rebellion in Zadar against Venetian rule. The citizens drove out the Venetian count, raised the Hungarian banner, and accepted Stephen as their master. When the Doge came with a fleet to recover the city, a Hungarian garrison had already reinforced it. Venice failed and withdrew. Against the odds, Stephen III had managed to restore Hungarian power almost to the level reached under his father. But unlike his father, he now faced an emperor who had finally made the northwestern Balkans a top priority. Manuel's response in 1165 was swift, broad, and remarkably well coordinated. He sent letters and envoys in every direction, demanding support or at least cooperation for a major campaign against Stephen III. The Serbian ruler was pressed to provide military help. Envoys in Galich and Kiev extracted promises from princes who had recently been courted by Andronicus. Henry Jasomirgott of Austria, who had once sheltered Stephen III, now pledged assistance to Manuel through family ties. Even Frederick Barbarossa, at least outwardly, showed agreement with Byzantine policy. The whole episode has the feel of an early attempt by the two empires to sort Hungary into spheres of influence at the expense of the Hungarian crown. Venice, too, joined the coalition. The Republic committed 100 ships to operations against Hungarian positions in Dalmatia, launching the offensive in May 1165. By the time Manuel himself reached the Danube, central Dalmatia had already fallen back into Byzantine hands, and the Venetians had recovered Zadar. The emperor did not command the Dalmatian operations in person. That task was entrusted to John Ducas, who moved through the Serbian lands and into Dalmatia with great speed. Some cities submitted after negotiation, others by force, but in a short time the whole region was brought under Byzantine authority again. Trogir, Šibenik, Split, and a long list of smaller towns and coastal communities all came over. The result was presented as complete and final. Yet the true centre of Manuel's attention lay farther inland. He chose to take personal charge of the campaign for Sirmium, even though the Empress was dangerously ill at the time. The struggle centred on Semlin, where the assault ended in a brutal sack and the death of many inhabitants. From there, Manuel pushed into Frangoturian and settled a body of Chalesian mercenaries in one of its fortresses, planting a loyal military presence in the heart of the contested region. Stephen III then tried to negotiate. He sent envoys promising to return Sirmium and Dalmatia, but Manuel replied with deliberate sarcasm, asking which Sirmium and which Dalmatia he meant, since the emperor already held territories known by both names. That answer summed up the new reality. Byzantium had returned not merely as a raiding power, but as a permanent force shaping the frontier. Before departing for Constantinople, Manuel left his generals to rebuild Semlin and strengthen the line behind it. Belgrade was repaired, walls were raised around Niš, and Braničevo was settled and fortified. The northwestern marches were being reorganized into a frontier system under firm imperial direction. In the autumn of that same year, Manuel made one of the most dramatic political moves of his reign. He designated his daughter Maria and her future husband Bela, now renamed Alexius, as his heirs. The leading aristocrats of the empire were compelled to swear allegiance to both. This act has often been used to support the old claim that Manuel intended to unite Hungary and Byzantium under one ruler and thereby absorb the kingdom into the empire. That interpretation goes too far. It assumes an ambition that does not fit the emperor's actions elsewhere. Manuel had never pursued the direct annexation of Hungary, and nothing in his frontier policy suggests that he suddenly adopted such a vast design. The elevation of Bela Alexius makes more sense in a different context. By 1165, Manuel had failed to produce a son, his wife had been seriously ill, and Andronicus had revealed once again how dangerous the succession question could be. For the first time, the possibility that Maria's husband might inherit was made fully explicit. Bela, living close to the emperor and already tied to the dynasty, became a convenient answer to an immediate dynastic problem. There may also have been a symbolic side to this decision. Bela's new name, Alexius, fit the imperial prophecy that the ruling line would continue through names, beginning with certain letters. Manuel had already used that tradition to justify his own accession, and the fact that Andronicus also fit the pattern may have made the matter feel more urgent. Even so, Manuel still did not fully commit himself to marrying his daughter to the Hungarian prince. In 1166, he considered another match entirely, one involving the young Norman king of Sicily. To make such a reversal possible, he even arranged a legal basis for cancelling the existing betrothal by confirming a church ruling that forbade marriage within the degree of kinship that linked Maria and Bela Alexius. When a son was finally born to Manuel in 1169, the engagement was formally annulled on those grounds. That alone is enough to show that the emperor had never been irrevocably bound to the idea of a union between his daughter and the Hungarian prince. The grand theory of a planned personal union between Hungary and Byzantium was a later construction, not Manuel's actual policy. Yet Bela Alexius was still enormously important. His rank, his proximity to the emperor, and the title bestowed upon him gave him a standing far beyond that of an ordinary foreign hostage or dynastic guest. He was perfectly placed to take over the political function once served by Stephen. Through him, Manuel could continue to influence events north of the Danube with confidence. For the moment, though, the emperor had already secured what he most wanted. A speech delivered near the beginning of 1166 lays out the political message of the settlement in terms that are grand, even exaggerated, but still revealing. It celebrated three major achievements. First, that Sirmium had been recognized as Byzantine territory. Second, that Croatia and Bosnia now stood under imperial authority after the recent campaigns. Third, that Esztergom, the coronation church and chief ecclesiastical seat of Hungary, had become subject to Byzantine sovereignty. Taken literally, those claims go too far. They belong to the language of imperial praise rather than to cold political fact. Sirmium was indeed under Byzantine control, but not through direct annexation. Authority there had been exercised through Hungarian figures, such as Stephen, and now through Bela Alexius. Croatia and Bosnia had acknowledged Byzantine supremacy, but that did not mean deep administrative transformation. Their local rulers could shift allegiance from one master to another with relatively little change in the daily fabric of power. As for Esztergom, its subjection almost certainly meant something far more specific and limited than the complete submission of the Hungarian Church. It may have meant no more than a recognition that the archbishop should support Bela Alexius's future claim and, if necessary, crown him. The real meaning lay in symbolism. Byzantium was reviving the old idea that legitimate Hungarian kingship still flowed, in some sense, from Constantinople. The crown, the title, and the authority behind both still belonged, in imperial rhetoric, to the emperor who stood above other kings. That claim had been expressed a century earlier in gifts and imagery. Manuel was now restating it, with renewed force. Even after the settlement of 1165, the struggle with Hungary was not entirely finished. Stephen III and the faction around him had good reason to resent the peace imposed upon them. Once diplomatic pressure began to ease, a new Hungarian expedition under Count Denis moved to recover Sirmium in 1166. Manuel entrusted the defence of the frontier to two commanders, Michael Gabras and Michael Branas. Their pairing exposed one of the tensions within the Komnenian system. Gabras had risen quickly through marriage into the imperial family and received a senior command despite his inexperience. Branas was older, harder, more seasoned, and deeply loyal, but his career had likely reached its upper limit. Their cooperation was poor. In the fighting, Branas is said to have shown open contempt for his nominal superior, mocking him even as he withdrew from danger. Whatever the exact truth of the anecdote, it reflects a real strain within an imperial order where rank increasingly followed kinship as much as experience. Manuel had to intervene again, and this time he did so with a more complex plan. He launched a three-pronged offensive against Hungary. One force was stationed along the Danube under Bela Alexius, preserving the usual formula of using a Hungarian claimant, or prince, to legitimize action in the border zone. Two other detachments under John Ducas entered Hungary through Transylvania and carried out a deep raid, seizing many captives. This was a deliberate return to the kind of surprise pressure that had worked so well in 1150. The prisoners became bargaining tools, and the emperor once again negotiated from strength. The peace that followed in 1166 was mediated by Henry Jasimigot and his Byzantine wife Theodora. Henry seems to have wanted more than a temporary frontier truce. He also sought to ease tensions between Manuel and Frederick Barbarossa, and the resulting arrangement appears to have marked out clearer spheres of influence in Hungary for the Eastern and Western empires alike. Henry himself gained greatly from this new order, becoming an even more important figure in Hungarian affairs and arranging a marriage between his daughter and Stephen III. For Byzantium and Germany alike, that was acceptable. But there was one group inside Hungary for whom this arrangement was intolerable: the warrior aristocracy. To them, the peace of 1166 looked like the triumph of foreign manipulation. Eastern and Western emperors, once rivals, now seemed to be cooperating in shaping the Hungarian crown. Their reaction was immediate. An attack was launched into Dalmatia, and in the following spring a massive army under Denis marched into Sirmium. This was not one more border probe. It was meant to be decisive. Stephen III himself may not even have controlled the movement fully. Some Western writers later suggested that he had sent Denis, but it makes more sense to see the campaign as driven by angry nobles who refused to accept a kingdom squeezed between foreign powers. Byzantine writers describe the army as huge, led by dozens of commanders, and the battle that followed was unlike the more limited encounters of earlier years. This time, there would be no room for negotiation. Denis is said to have ordered his men to drink to the health of the enemy before taking the field, as if to show their confidence before the clash. The fighting ended in disaster for the Hungarians. The plain was covered with bodies. Several of their leading commanders were taken alive. Hundreds of soldiers were captured, and the spoils of the battlefield were immense. Byzantine sources treated this as the true ending of the war, the moment when Hungarian resistance was finally broken. Dalmatia remained an active theatre during these same years. In 1166, a Hungarian counterattack, led by Ban Ampud, attempted to undo the recent Byzantine gains. The attack on Split failed, but the Hungarians managed to capture the Byzantine governor when he rode out from the city. There is some evidence that places like Beograd and perhaps Šibenik were briefly recovered, which forced Manuel to consider another major intervention in the region. His plans were delayed by conspiracy in Constantinople. But after the great victory in Sirmium in 1167, Byzantine authority was restored across the southern part of Dalmatia. The Venetians, rewarded for their assistance in earlier campaigns, controlled the northern sector above Zadar, while a Byzantine governor ruled the south. That arrangement held through much of the 1170s. Venetian counts remained in the northern coastal cities and islands, while the southern zone was administered by Byzantine officers. A succession of governors held the office, each carrying both military and judicial authority. The Byzantine governor was the highest judge in the region, the man to whom local priors appealed in disputes, negotiations, and settlements. His role was not merely symbolic. He could arbitrate conflicts between cities and neighbouring chiefs, settle tribute disputes, and protect trade routes against piracy. This was especially important along the eastern Adriatic, where local Slavic lords and maritime raiders could still disrupt commerce if not kept in check. The relationship between Byzantium and Dalmatia during these years was notably flexible. Manuel did not attempt to force the region into a rigid, orthodox framework. In fact, his policy toward the Latin Church in Dalmatia was strikingly tolerant. This was one reason later Latin churchmen remembered him favourably. He allowed papal ecclesiastical authority to continue and did not try to replace it with direct patriarchal control from Constantinople. That restraint helped preserve stability and may also have served a larger political purpose. Manuel was spending much of the 1160s and 1170s negotiating with the papacy about possible union between the Eastern and Western churches and about his own status as universal emperor. Dalmatia was the ideal place to demonstrate that an Orthodox emperor could rule Catholic populations without oppression. So when archbishops were appointed in Split, it was still the Pope, not Manuel, who made the final choice. The emperor welcomed these churchmen, treated them lavishly when they came to Constantinople, and left papal jurisdiction formally intact. In return, the papacy recognized the primacy of Split in Byzantine Dalmatia. That raises the deeper question of why Dalmatia mattered so much to Manuel at all. The answer lies not only on the eastern Adriatic coast, but across the sea in Italy. For Manuel, Dalmatia was not a dead-end frontier. It was part of the Adriatic world, a bridge toward the politics of northern Italy, where Byzantium and Frederick Barbarossa were now competing constantly. The Byzantine governor in Dalmatia was not merely a local administrator. He also had responsibilities tied to Italian affairs. The same men who organized alliances on the Adriatic coast also moved between Venice, Ancona, and the Lombard cities, carrying money, promises, and political influence. Ancona was especially important. Already in the late 1140s, Manuel had seen it as a base for imperial operations and for the distribution of Byzantine funds in Italy. Throughout the 1150s and 1160s, agents sent from Ancona worked to build networks of support among northern Italian cities. German commanders complained openly that Byzantine gold was circulating everywhere. Contemporary sources from both sides make clear that the emperor had friends, agents, and sympathizers in city after city. The exact extent of that influence is impossible to measure, but it reached widely into Cremona, Ferrara, Genoa, Milan, Padua, Pisa, Ravenna, Siena, Venice, and beyond. After 1165, the same Dalmatian governor who had secured Venice's help also persuaded important Italian cities to align quietly with Manuel. The secrecy did not last. Everyone knew that Byzantine influence in Italy was growing. In 1167, while the governor of Dalmatia was temporarily in Hungarian hands, the Germans launched another siege of Ancona, explicitly hoping to seize the imperial treasure stored there. Even then, Byzantine diplomacy continued. Agreements were made between Dalmatian cities and Italian communes, especially Pisa, at the very moment when relations with Venice were deteriorating. When the Venetians later joined another German attack on Ancona, the Byzantine governor of Dalmatia was found inside the city itself, commanding a garrison and distributing money to allies in the north. Eventually, his diplomacy helped save the city. Lombard forces came to Ancona's relief, and even hostile sources admitted that Byzantine gold had played a decisive role in bringing them there. There are strong signs that throughout Manuel's reign, the Hungarian court consistently tried to lift up Serbian magnates in Raška, who were not the ones favoured by Constantinople. That pattern can be seen clearly in the career of Deza. He had first relied on Hungarian support during his earlier seizure of power, and after that, he was eventually recognised by Manuel as Grand Jupan, probably sometime around 1161. Yet even after receiving that position from the emperor, Deza remained politically suspect. At some point, likely in 1165, Manuel learned that he had addressed the Hungarian king as his lord. That was enough to bring him to trial. He was condemned and carried off to Constantinople in chains. Around the same time, a new order was imposed in Raška. A ruler named Tihomir was installed, and he did not govern alone. His 3 brothers ruled with him, sharing out the land under a structure clearly supervised from above. The youngest of them was Stefan Nemanja. Contemporary rhetoric from Constantinople celebrated the arrangement by saying that the Serbs had accepted the leader given to them by the emperor. Each brother was assigned a district, apparently through the same kind of careful division that had once been imposed on rival Serbian claimants in earlier settlements. Nemanja received the region of Duboctica. If Nemanja owed his early rise to imperial favour, he did not remain grateful for long. During the Byzantine-Hungarian Wars of 1166 and 1167, he took advantage of the distraction to enlarge his own position. He even pushed toward the coast and seized Kotor, an important maritime city. Then he turned directly against his own brother, Tihomir, and, before 1168, drove him out and assumed the title of Grand Jupan for himself. His growing independence forced Constantinople to react. In the autumn of 1168, Manuel sent a force against him under Theodore Padiates, not yet committing himself fully, but testing Nemanja's intentions. Nemanja responded with open hostility, striking the imperial force and beginning an undeclared war. But when he learned that the emperor himself was moving against him, his courage faltered. He appeared briefly in the field and then vanished into the mountains, hiding among caves sealed with stones. In the end, he did what so many Balkan rulers had done before him. He came forward, humbled himself, and threw himself at the emperor's feet. The act itself was not unusual. Ritual submission had long been part of the political language of the region. What mattered was the meaning behind it. Nemanja feared not only punishment, but replacement. He knew very well that the emperor could remove him and raise up some other Serbian ruler in his place, perhaps even one of the brothers he had overthrown. That moment of submission did not create lasting loyalty. Nemanja's later behaviour shows that clearly enough, and Byzantine writers were hardly surprised. Among them, Serbian unreliability had become almost a literary commonplace. One chronicler later claimed that what finally brought on Manuel's last great intervention in Serbia was Nemanja's connection with Venice, after the sweeping arrest of Venetians across the empire in 1171. That final campaign also coincided with a major turning point in Hungary. Stephen III died in March 1172 at only 25 years of age. Almost immediately there were rumours that he had been poisoned at the instigation of his brother Bela, the same prince who had spent years in Constantinople as Manuel's protégé. Whether those rumours were true cannot be known, but Stephen's death finally opened the way for Manuel to place Bela on the Hungarian throne. In return, Bela was required to promise that he would never meddle in the affairs of Rashka unless the emperor directed him to do so. By then, Bela's place within the Byzantine world had changed, but not disappeared. He was no longer the co-heir at Constantinople, and he had surrendered the exalted rank once tied to that status. Yet, he had married into the imperial family and now held the title of Kaiser, which still placed him inside the imperial hierarchy. He remained beneath the emperor, but above nearly every other foreign ruler. That relationship did not amount to the full feudal subjection that some historians later imagined, because no such exact and binding framework was imposed on Hungary. Still, Bela's position did imply something important. His kingdom was treated as one of the empire's dependent allies. In that sense, Hungary was placed in a category not unlike Jerusalem, not annexed, not directly ruled, but drawn firmly into the orbit of Constantinople. With Hungary stabilized in this way, Manuel was free to turn his attention back to Rashka. He marched into the mountains with a relatively small force, enough to remind Nemanja where real power still lay. Once again the Serbian ruler avoided battle. Once again he chose submission. This time his surrender was staged even more dramatically. One account says he approached barefoot, bare-armed, with a rope around his neck and a sword in his hand, like a condemned man placing himself at the mercy of his judge. Manuel then took him back to Constantinople, where Nemanja was displayed in a triumphal procession as a defeated barbarian prince. He was also shown paintings commissioned by the emperor, depicting victories over the Serbs. According to one court speaker, Nemanja viewed the images and approved of everything, complaining only that the artist had not made his status as the emperor's slave even clearer. That word, slave, carried a political meaning here. It described the relationship created by prostration and submission, the bond of subordination that imperial ceremony was meant to make visible to everyone. So, by 1172, both the King of Hungary and the Grand Jupan of the Serbs had openly submitted themselves to Manuel's authority. And for the remaining years of his reign, both appear to have stayed loyal. Their loyalty was tested in 1176, when each sent troops to support Manuel's grand eastern campaign against Kili Arslan. That campaign ended in the famous disaster at Myriosephalon, near Iconium. The defeat was severe, and many later writers treated it as a moment of divine punishment, the turning point when Manuel's overreaching ambitions finally collapsed. Even some of his own clergy were quick to point out his failings. Yet the defeat did not produce the immediate ruin that is often imagined. Byzantium's eastern frontier did not simply disintegrate. Manuel remained active in the east during the last years of his life, and he continued to negotiate with strength enough to secure terms that were by no means wholly favourable to his enemies. Even Western observers reported that the Seljuk ruler felt enough pressure to explore unlikely alliances against Byzantium. Meanwhile, in the west, Hungary and Serbia continued to hold to the emperor, largely because Manuel remained watchful and prevented them from drifting back into common cause with each other, or, even more dangerously, into the orbit of the German emperor. After 1160, the way Byzantine writers described Serbs and Hungarians became more revealing than ever. The poetic court rhetoric of the earlier years faded, and later praise came more often in polished prose from major churchmen and senior intellectuals. Yet, the core themes remained. Manuel was still presented as a master of foreign affairs and a victorious emperor, especially in the Balkans. The Serbs, in particular, played a central role in this imagery. Again and again the Serbian Grand Jupan appeared as the emperor's opposite. Where Manuel was powerful, he was weak. Where Manuel was radiant, he was shadowed. Where Manuel was master, he was servant. Above all, he was shown as the emperor's subordinate, the political inferior whose identity only gained meaning through submission. That image had deep roots in Byzantine imperial culture. The role played by the Serbian ruler under Manuel closely resembled the one Bulgarian rulers had once filled in the age of earlier emperors. Submission, prostration, and the visual language of defeat remained central to imperial self-presentation. Even in 1166, Manuel was already using victory titles in the old Roman style, naming himself conqueror of Dalmatia, Hungary, Bosna, and Croatia. Yet as he grew older, the tone of imperial praise shifted. Martial energy still mattered, but the emperor could no longer always be portrayed as the young fighter who led charges in person. His generals began to take a more visible role in public celebrations, while Manuel himself increasingly appeared as something else. The ruler who brought order, the judge who settled disputes, the peacemaker who transformed wild peoples by drawing them into Roman civilization. In that sense, his image began to resemble that of older, more ceremonially minded emperors. He continued to use triumphs, court ritual, and public spectacle with enormous skill. His palaces, especially the complex at Blacenay, became stages for political memory. Their walls were decorated with painted scenes of enemies cast down and subject rulers kneeling in submission. The residences of leading aristocrats were decorated in similar ways. One powerful court figure even fell into disgrace for choosing to adorn his home with images celebrating the deeds of the Sultan instead of the emperor. Such details show how central frontier victories had become to domestic politics. They were not just military events. They were messages directed at the imperial elite, especially at the high aristocracy, whose loyalty could not always be taken for granted. Manuel's image also had to travel beyond the capital. It had to be displayed in Rome, at Esztergom, in Italian cities, and even in makeshift tribunals in the Serbian highlands. The ideological centre of his later foreign policy was his claim to be the true king of kings, the one Roman emperor who stood above lesser Christian rulers. He tried to make that claim credible, not only through force, but through calculated moderation. In Dalmatia and Italy, he showed generosity and tolerance, especially toward Latin Christians. In Hungary, his policy never amounted to an attempt to reduce the kingdom to outright servitude. His claims there were not fundamentally more extreme than those advanced by earlier Byzantine emperors, when they sent crowns and asserted the old hierarchy of states. By the settlement of 1172, he had finally secured the arrangement he had wanted across the Danube since his earliest confrontations with Serbs and Hungarians. A compliant belt of dependent powers that recognized Byzantine supremacy without being swallowed directly into the empire. Even so, the fleeting nature of Manuel's achievements makes it impossible not to ask whether this ambitious policy had rested on a faulty foundation. His advance beyond the Danube and his activism in the northern Balkans were driven by a strategic fear. The idea that German expansion into Hungary and Italy posed a growing threat to Byzantium. That fear intensified after the Second Crusade, when Western and Eastern concerns became tightly linked and when the rhetoric of Latin unity under the German emperor appeared increasingly dangerous. Yet modern understanding has shown that the language of German universal empire was often no more realistic than the grand claims issuing from Manuel's own court. The key problem was not that either emperor could fully realize his propaganda, but that each believed enough of the other's claims to act accordingly. That mutual suspicion helped fuel the long, cold rivalry that marked much of the period from 1156 to 1180. Manuel may have thought that his relationship with Pope Alexander III gave him an advantage in that rivalry. For a time, it certainly seemed to. Alexander's position had been challenged by the German-backed anti-pope, and as the schism deepened, he looked for allies wherever he could find them. At that moment, Manuel seemed a possible partner. Embassies moved frequently between Rome and Constantinople. Latin theologians found favour at the Byzantine court. Important doctrinal discussions were encouraged, and Manuel even called a synod partly to support positions advanced by Western churchmen close to the Pope. Clearly, the emperor hoped that church union might secure something even greater: recognition as the one true Roman emperor. If that had happened, the advantages would have been immense. It would have strengthened his claims in southern Italy and in the Crusader East, while sharply limiting the ideological reach of the German emperor. But this vision was never likely to be fully realised. There is no real sign that Alexander III ever intended to strip Frederick Barbarossa of the imperial title, even while he was contesting him fiercely. Manuel's negotiations with the papacy therefore rested on an illusion almost as much as his fears of total German encirclement did. And while these great powers argued over recognition, titles, and universal authority, smaller powers across the Adriatic and Balkans often prospered. Hungary, though pressured from both sides, still gained room for manoeuvre. Venice benefited enormously from the imperial rivalry, switching alignments when useful and profiting from both Byzantine expansion in Dalmatia and German pressure in Italy. The Norman kingdom never suffered the joint Byzantine-German assault that had once been imagined. In the Balkans themselves, local rulers, regional elites, and city leaders often prospered through Manuel's habit of buying loyalty with money and privilege. Yet, it would be unfair to judge Manuel only by what he failed to achieve. Medieval political systems were strongest not when they ruled every corner directly, but when they could draw their outer zones into profitable relationships with the centre. By that standard, Manuel's reign was a real success. His memory endured warmly in places like Dalmatia and Italy, because he was seen there as a powerful Christian emperor, a generous patron, and a ruler who distributed wealth freely. The people of Dalmatian cities took his money gladly, just as local rulers in other frontier regions had benefited from imperial largesse. His reputation for giving became legendary. Long after his death, Western crusaders repeated stories of an emperor richer and more generous than any Christian ruler they had ever heard of. That reputation survived because it contrasted so sharply with the insecurity and weakness that followed under his successors. So even if Manuel never achieved the grand ideal of a single Christian empire under his rule, his imperial policy still had real successes. He pushed the frontier across the Danube, gained influence in Hungary and Italy through force, negotiation and money, and used the resources of a prosperous empire to bind distant rulers and communities to himself. He crushed rebellions efficiently, neutralized dangerous rivals, and held together a remarkably wide political world. The real tragedy is that his successors could not sustain what he had built. They failed to command the same loyalty, failed to distribute resources in the same way, and failed to contain rebellion in the outlying provinces. In the Balkans, this failure proved disastrous. One revolt there could not be suppressed, despite years of effort, and eventually produced what is now called the Second Bulgarian Empire. At the same time, the Serbs under Stefan Nemanja broke away and ceased to recognize Byzantine supremacy. His son would go on to become the first crowned king of the Serbs. Elsewhere too, the alliances Manuel had cultivated, especially in northern Italy, were neglected and allowed to collapse. When the empire later faced a major Western assault, the network of aid that might once have saved it was no longer there. Throughout Manuel's reign, there are clear signs that Hungary regularly tried to strengthen Serbian lords in Raška, who were not the men preferred by Constantinople. Deza is a good example of this pattern. He had already relied on Hungarian backing when he first pushed his way into power in the early 1150s. Later, after Manuel reasserted control in the region, Deza was himself raised to the position of Grand Jupan, probably sometime around 1161. But even then, his loyalty remained questionable. At some point, likely in 1165, the emperor learned that Deza had addressed the Hungarian king as his lord. That was enough to destroy whatever trust remained. Deza was summoned, put on trial, convicted, and imprisoned in Constantinople. Soon after, a new political order was imposed on Raška. A ruler named Tihomir was set over the Serbs, and he governed alongside his three brothers. The youngest of them was Stefan Nemanja. Contemporary imperial rhetoric celebrated this arrangement by claiming that the Serbs had accepted the leader given to them by the emperor. The land itself seems to have been divided among the brothers, each receiving his own sphere of rule. Nemanja was assigned Dubočica. If Nemanja owed his early prominence to Byzantine decision-making, he did not stay loyal for long. He used the distraction created by the wars between Byzantium and Hungary in 1166 and 1167 to strengthen his own position. He expanded his territory, reached toward the coast, and even seized Kotor. Then, he moved directly against his brother, Tihomir. Before 1168, he had driven him out and taken the title of Grand Jupan for himself. This could not be ignored. In the autumn of 1168, Manuel responded by sending Theodore Padiates with troops to test Nemanja's intentions and, if needed, discipline him. Nemanja answered with open aggression, attacking imperial forces and beginning war without formal declaration. But once he realized that the emperor himself was moving against him, his confidence collapsed. He appeared only briefly in battle and then retreated into the mountain country, hiding among caves blocked with stones. In the end, like so many Balkan rulers before him, he chose submission. He came before Manuel, humbled himself, and threw himself at the emperor's feet. That act was more than theatrical. Nemanja understood exactly what was at stake. He feared not only punishment, but replacement. The emperor had raised rulers in Raška before, and he could do so again. That submission did not create lasting obedience. Nemanja soon showed that his promises were worth little, and Byzantine writers were hardly surprised. In their eyes, Serbian instability had become almost expected. One historian later claimed that Manuel's final great move against Serbia was triggered by Nemanja's dealings with Venice after the arrest of Venetians across the empire in 1171. At almost the same time, a major political change was taking place in Hungary. Stephen III died in March 1172, still a young man. Rumours spread quickly that he had been poisoned at the prompting of his brother, Bela, the prince who had spent years in Constantinople under Manuel's protection. Whether that accusation was true cannot be known, but Stephen's death gave Manuel the opportunity he had long wanted. He was finally able to place Bela on the Hungarian throne. In return, Bela pledged that he would never interfere in the affairs of Raška unless the emperor ordered him to do so. By then, Bela's position in the Byzantine world had changed, but he had not been pushed outside it. He was no longer the emperor's designated co-heir in Constantinople, and he had given up the title once tied to that status. Even so, he had married into the imperial family, and now held the rank of Caesar. That rank still placed him firmly inside the Byzantine order, under the emperor, but above nearly every other foreign ruler. This did not amount to the formal feudal subjection of Hungary, as some later writers tried to suggest. No such binding framework had been imposed. Still, the relationship mattered. Bela's kingdom was now treated as one of the empire's dependent allies. It stood in a similar position to Jerusalem, not annexed, not directly governed, but closely tied to Constantinople and expected to acknowledge the superiority of the emperor. With Hungary stabilized, Manuel could turn again to Rashka. He led a relatively small force into the mountains, enough to show Nemanja that the empire's attention had returned. Once more, Nemanja avoided battle. Once more, he chose submission. This second surrender was presented in even more dramatic form. One account says he approached with his head bare, his arms uncovered, his feet unshod, a rope around his neck, and a sword in his hand like a condemned man placing himself before a judge. Manuel then brought him back to Constantinople, where Nemanja was displayed in a triumphal procession as a defeated barbarian prince. He was also shown the wall paintings commissioned by the emperor to celebrate victories over the Serbs. A court speaker later claimed that Nemanja accepted everything he saw and complained only that the artist had not made his status as the emperor's slave even clearer. The word mattered. In this context, slavery meant political submission, the condition created by ritual prostration before the emperor. So by 1172, both the King of Hungary and the Grand Jupan of the Serbs had openly submitted to Manuel's authority, and for the rest of his reign both appear to have remained loyal. Their loyalty was tested in 1176, when each sent troops to support Manuel's Great Eastern campaign against Kilij Arslan. That expedition ended in disaster at Myriosephalon near Iconium. The defeat was serious, and many later writers treated it as the moment when Manuel's ambitions were finally broken by divine judgment. Even some of his own clergy were quick to point out his failings. Yet the defeat did not bring immediate collapse. The eastern frontier did not simply disintegrate. Manuel remained active in the east during his final years and continued to negotiate from a position that was not wholly weak. Some Western reports even claimed that the Seljuk ruler felt enough pressure to consider striking improbable alliances against Byzantium. In the West, meanwhile, Hungary and Serbia stayed loyal, largely because Manuel kept watch over them and prevented them from joining forces against him or falling into the orbit of the German emperor. After 1160, the way Byzantine writers described the Hungarians, and especially the Serbs, became even more revealing. Earlier poetic court rhetoric gave way increasingly to polished prose written by bishops and high-ranking churchmen, but the central message did not change. Manuel was still praised as a victorious emperor and master of foreign policy, especially in the Balkans. The Serbian Grand Jupan became a key figure in this image. Time and again he appeared as the emperor's opposite. Manuel was strong, while the Jupan was weak. Manuel was glorious, while the Jupan was humiliated. Manuel ruled, while the Jupan obeyed. Above all, the Serbian ruler was portrayed as the emperor's subordinate, the political inferior whose place in the world was defined by submission. This was not new in Byzantine political culture. The role played by the Serbian ruler under Manuel closely resembled the role earlier Bulgarian rulers had played in imperial imagery. Submission, prostration, and the visual language of conquest remained central to the way Byzantine rule was presented. Manuel himself embraced this style openly. In 1166, he was already using victory titles in the old Roman manner, presenting himself as conqueror of Dalmatia, Hungary, Bosnia, and Croatia. Still, as he aged, the nature of imperial praise changed. He could no longer always be shown as the young warrior who personally led every charge. His generals became more visible in triumphal displays, while Manuel himself was increasingly cast in another role, as the peacemaker, the judge, the ruler who tamed wild peoples by bringing them under Roman order. In that sense, his image began to resemble that of older emperors who had relied heavily on ceremony and public symbolism. Manuel made remarkable use of triumphs, palaces, and visual display. At Blachernay, the imperial residence was decorated with scenes of enemies cast down and subject rulers prostrate before the throne. The residences of leading aristocrats were adorned in similar ways. One powerful court figure even fell into disgrace for decorating his home with scenes celebrating the deeds of the Sultan instead of those of the emperor. Such details show how important frontier victories had become to political life in the capital. They were not just military events. They were messages directed at the elite, especially at the powerful aristocrats, whose loyalty could not always be taken for granted. Manuel also had to project his authority beyond Constantinople. His image had to reach Rome, Esztergom, the courts of the Balkans, the cities of Italy, and even improvised tribunals, held in the Serbian highlands. The ideological foundation of his later foreign policy was his claim to be the true king of kings, the one Roman emperor standing above lesser Christian rulers. He tried to make that claim believable, not only through force, but through deliberate moderation. In Dalmatia and Italy, he showed generosity and unusual tolerance, especially toward Latin Christians. In Hungary, his policy never truly became an attempt to reduce the kingdom to full servitude. His claims there were not much more extreme than those made by earlier Byzantine emperors, who had sent crowns northward and insisted on the old hierarchy of states. By the settlement of 1172, he had finally secured the arrangement he had wanted across the Danube since his earliest clashes with Serbs and Hungarians, a belt of dependent powers that recognized Byzantine supremacy without being swallowed directly into the empire. Even so, the short-lived nature of Manuel's achievements forces a hard question. Was this ambitious foreign policy built on a mistaken view of the world? His push beyond the Danube and his intense activity in the Balkans had been driven by a strategic fear that German expansion into Hungary and Italy posed a growing danger to Byzantium. That fear sharpened after the Second Crusade, when Western and Eastern problems became more tightly connected, and when the language of Latin unity under the German emperor seemed increasingly threatening. Yet modern judgment has shown that German universalist rhetoric was often no more realistic than the grand claims made in Manuel's own court. The real problem was not that either ruler could fully realize the imperial visions promoted by propaganda. It was that each believed enough of the other's claims to act as if they might be real. That mutual suspicion fed the long, cold rivalry that marked much of the period from 1156 to 1180. Manuel may have believed that his relationship with Pope Alexander III gave him an edge in that rivalry. For a time, it certainly appeared so. Alexander's position was contested by the German-backed rival pope, and during the schism he sought allies, wherever he could find them. Manuel seemed one possible partner. Embassies moved frequently between Rome and Constantinople. Latin theologians found favour at the Byzantine court. Important doctrinal discussions were encouraged, and Manuel even summoned a synod, partly to support positions advanced by Western churchmen close to the Pope. Clearly, the emperor hoped that church union might bring something even greater: recognition as the one true Roman emperor. If that had happened, the consequences would have been enormous. It would have strengthened his claims in southern Italy and in the Crusader East, while limiting the reach of the German emperor. But this hope was never very likely to be fulfilled. There is no clear sign that Alexander III ever truly intended to strip Frederick Barbarossa of the imperial title, even while fighting him. Manuel's negotiations with the papacy therefore rested on an illusion, almost as much as his fear of total German encirclement did. And while the great powers argued over titles, rank, and universal authority, smaller powers often gained the most. Hungary, though squeezed between two empires, still found room to maneuver. Venice profited greatly from the rivalry, shifting allegiance when useful and benefiting both from Byzantine expansion in Dalmatia and from German pressure in Italy. The Norman kingdom never suffered the great combined Byzantine-German assault that had once seemed possible. In the Balkans themselves, local rulers, city bosses and regional elites often prospered through Manuel's willingness to buy loyalty with money, privilege and recognition. Still, it would be wrong to judge Manuel only by what he failed to accomplish. Medieval political systems were strongest, not when they ruled every corner directly, but when they could draw their outer regions into profitable and durable relationships with the centre. By that measure, Manuel's reign was a real success. His memory remained warm in places like Dalmatia and Italy because he was remembered there as a powerful Christian emperor, a generous patron, and a ruler who distributed wealth freely. The cities of Dalmatia received his money gladly, just as local rulers elsewhere had benefited from imperial largesse. His reputation for giving became legendary. Long after his death, Western Crusaders repeated stories of an emperor richer and more generous than any Christian ruler they had known. That memory endured because it stood in such sharp contrast to the weakness and insecurity that followed under his successors. So even if Manuel never achieved the grand dream of a single Christian empire under his authority, his policy still produced important results. He pushed the imperial frontier beyond the Danube, gained influence in Hungary and Italy through force, diplomacy and money, and used the resources of a wealthy empire to bind distant rulers and communities to himself. He crushed rebellions effectively, neutralized dangerous rivals, and held together an extraordinarily wide political world. The real tragedy came afterward. His successors could not sustain what he had built. They failed to command the same respect, failed to distribute resources in the same way, and failed to contain rebellion in the outer provinces. In the Balkans, this weakness had lasting consequences. One revolt there could not be suppressed despite years of struggle and eventually produced what is now called the Second Bulgarian Empire. At the same time, the Serbs under Stefan Nemanja broke away and never again accepted Byzantine supremacy. Nemanja's son would become the first crowned king of the Serbs. Elsewhere too, the alliances Manuel had built, especially in northern Italy, were neglected and allowed to decay. When the empire later faced a major assault from the west, the network of support that might once have helped save it was no longer there. In 1185, the Byzantine world was shaken by a sudden and violent crisis. The Norman kingdom of Sicily launched a major invasion across the Adriatic, striking first at Dyrrhachium, and then driving toward Thessalonica. This attack did not come out of nowhere. It was fueled by deep instability inside Byzantium itself. The rise of Andronicus to power, marked by brutality and suspicion, had driven several powerful Byzantine figures into exile. Some of them fled west, seeking refuge and support in Sicily. At the same time, the massacre of Latin residents in Constantinople a few years earlier had left lasting bitterness. These events gave the Normans both motive and opportunity. Officially, they claimed they were marching to restore the rightful emperor, the young Alexius II. In reality, that was impossible. The boy had already been murdered. Yet, just as earlier invaders had used pretenders to justify their campaigns, the Normans produced a false Alexius and presented him as a legitimate ruler. The deception worked surprisingly well. In Dalmatia and along the Adriatic coast, several regional leaders accepted the pretender and gave their support to the Norman cause. The invasion began with remarkable speed. Dyrrhachium, a key gateway into the Balkans, fell without resistance. Its governor chose surrender over the risk of facing imperial punishment. That single decision had enormous consequences. There was no time to prepare defensive lines in the mountain passes, and no coordinated naval response could be organized. Norman forces advanced rapidly by land and sea, converging on Thessalonica, the empire's second city. What followed was one of the most devastating moments in late Byzantine history. Thessalonica fell after a short but brutal struggle. The city's defences collapsed, and chaos spread through its streets. Thousands were killed. Some died fighting, others were crushed in desperate attempts to flee to churches or fortified areas. The scale of destruction shocked contemporaries. The Norman army itself was vast, numbering tens of thousands, supported by cavalry, ships, and bands of irregular fighters who sought plunder and glory rather than pay. Even so, they suffered losses of their own, not only in battle but also from disease. Yet these losses meant little compared to the devastation inflicted on the city. The fall of Thessalonica exposed more than military weakness. It revealed deep fractures within Byzantine society. The city was defended by a diverse population. Soldiers came from many regions and peoples, including Alans, Iberians, Germans, and Bulgarians. Clergy and civilians alike took part in the defence. There was even a strong religious element, centred on the cult of Saint Demetrius, the city's patron. Yet unity was fragile. The imperial authorities remained distant and local leadership was divided. The governor of the city, driven by fear and mistrust, failed to act decisively. His hesitation, combined with the emperor's harsh rule, left Thessalonica exposed. The Normans themselves appeared alien and unsettling to many observers. Their behaviour seemed crude and destructive, especially when compared to the refined culture of Byzantium. They showed little understanding of the value of luxury goods, often destroying items of great worth while taking interest in simple tools and weapons. But this contrast reveals more than just cultural difference. It highlights a deeper divide within the empire itself. The refined values of Constantinople did not always match the realities of life in provincial cities. To many ordinary people, the Normans may not have seemed entirely foreign. Their practical mindset, their focus on tools and survival, may even have felt familiar. The shock of Thessalonica's fall sent panic through Constantinople. The capital prepared for siege. Defensive measures were rushed into place. Yet the greatest danger came not from the enemy outside, but from unrest within. The emperor had already lost the support of the population. As fear spread, opposition grew. In a dramatic confrontation near the heart of the city, Andronicus was overthrown. He was seized by an angry crowd, publicly humiliated, and killed. A new ruler, Isaac Angelus, was raised to power. Isaac moved quickly to respond to the Norman threat. A counterattack was launched, gathering whatever forces could be assembled. Fortune played a role. The Norman army was divided into separate groups, scattered across the region. This allowed Byzantine forces to strike isolated targets. In a series of engagements, they managed to defeat advancing Norman troops and disrupt their campaign. A decisive battle near the Strymon River broke the momentum of the invasion. Survivors retreated toward the coast, and many were killed in the aftermath. Gradually, the Normans withdrew, abandoning their gains. Yet even in victory, Byzantium's position remained fragile. The empire had survived the invasion, but at a heavy cost. Control over the Balkans was weakening. Local rulers were acting independently, forming alliances with foreign powers. Serbian leaders, for example, negotiated directly with the Normans. In Bulgaria and among the Vlachs, unrest was growing. Soon after, a major rebellion erupted in the Balkan interior. This uprising began not as a grand movement for independence, but as a reaction to imperial taxation. In order to fund his political ambitions, Isaac imposed heavy levies on populations that were not accustomed to such demands. The burden fell particularly hard on pastoral communities in the mountains. Their leaders attempted to negotiate, seeking privileges and recognition. Instead, they were dismissed and humiliated. That moment proved decisive. Anger turned into rebellion. Two brothers, Peter and Asen, emerged as leaders of the uprising. At first, their followers hesitated. The challenge seemed too great. To overcome this fear, the brothers turned to religion. They invoked the protection of Saint Demetrius, claiming that the saint had abandoned Byzantium and now supported their cause. This message spread quickly. It united different groups and gave the rebellion a powerful sense of purpose. The revolt began with raids on nearby settlements. Villages were attacked, livestock seized, and captives taken. Imperial forces responded, but struggled to engage the rebels in open battle. The mountainous terrain favoured the insurgents. They avoided direct confrontation, striking quickly and disappearing into difficult ground. At one point, Imperial troops achieved a temporary success, forcing the rebels to retreat. But the victory was short-lived. The rebels soon returned, strengthened by alliances with steppe warriors from beyond the Danube. At this stage, the conflict transformed. What had begun as local unrest became a major regional war. The rebels expanded their operations, attacking fortified cities and establishing control over large areas. They were no longer simply resisting imperial authority. They were building their own power. Over time, this movement would give rise to a new political entity, later known as the Second Bulgarian Empire. The Byzantine response was inconsistent. Commanders were appointed, campaigns launched, but success remained elusive. Some generals lacked experience in dealing with mobile enemy forces. Others were driven by personal ambition rather than loyalty. Rebellions broke out within the imperial ranks themselves. At critical moments, internal conflict weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats. One of the most serious challenges came during the passage of the Third Crusade. The German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa led a massive army across the Balkans on its way to the Holy Land. His journey through Byzantine territory was marked by suspicion and tension. Agreements were made, but trust was fragile. Skirmishes broke out. Supplies were scarce, local officials acted aggressively, and the Crusaders responded in kind. Relations deteriorated rapidly. At the same time, Balkan rulers sought to use the situation to their advantage. Serbian leaders offered support to the German emperor, hoping to secure recognition of their conquests. The leaders of the Vlach-Bulgar uprising also reached out, offering troops in exchange for legitimacy. These negotiations alarmed the Byzantine court. The possibility of a united front against Constantinople became a real fear. Although Barbarossa eventually continued his journey east, the damage had been done. The passage of the Crusade revealed how vulnerable Byzantine authority had become. It showed that external powers could interfere directly in Balkan affairs. It also demonstrated that local rulers were willing to seek support beyond the empire. In the years that followed, the situation continued to deteriorate. Imperial campaigns achieved occasional successes, but they were undermined by internal instability. Rivalries within the ruling elite led to repeated coups and revolts. Commanders turned against the emperor. Regions slipped out of control. The empire struggled to maintain even its core territories. Meanwhile, the rebels in the north consolidated their position. They fortified cities, organized their administration, and even began issuing their own coinage. This was a clear sign of independence. Byzantine authority had not just weakened. In many areas, it had effectively disappeared. By the end of the century, the transformation was complete. The empire's frontier had retreated dramatically. The mountains that once lay deep within imperial territory now marked its northern boundary. Beyond them, new powers had emerged. In Serbia, rulers no longer looked to Constantinople for legitimacy. In Bulgaria, a new state had taken shape, drawing on older traditions of independence. Even former allies and dependents now treated the Byzantine emperor with open disregard. In December 1199, Pope Innocent III answered a letter from Kalojun and addressed him with deliberate caution, calling him a noble man rather than recognizing the full status he desired. Kalojan's original message has not survived, but the Pope's reply makes its general purpose clear. At some earlier point, probably not long after Kalojan's rise to power, he had presented himself as devoted to Rome and had asked that a papal mission be sent to discuss a political and ecclesiastical settlement. The terms he seems to have wanted were ambitious. He was prepared to recognize papal authority over the Christians in the lands he controlled, but only if Rome in return acknowledged him as the rightful ruler of an independent realm. He claimed the title of emperor for himself and wanted the church at Trnovo raised to patriarchal status. Yet, he did not answer the Pope at once. Only in 1202 did he resume the exchange, by which time his position had changed. He had campaigned further against Byzantium, strengthened his control, and entered into negotiations with Alexius III that only sharpened his desire to step away from the authority of Constantinople. In the spring of 1201, Kalojan struck a major blow against Byzantium by capturing the last imperial strongholds northeast of the Balkan range, the Black Sea ports of Constantia and Varna. Their loss mattered enormously. It was not simply a territorial setback. It crippled the empire's ability to recover control over the lower Danube region. The sea route that linked Constantinople to the northern shore was broken, and with it, much of the empire's ability to move ships, men, and supplies into the area. This damage was both military and economic. Without those ports, Byzantine naval activity north of the mountains became much harder, while long-distance trade between the centre and the northern frontier was also weakened. In the longer term, these same ports gave the new Bulgarian realm a gateway to the outside world. Goods from its interior could now move toward the sea, and its rulers could cultivate closer links with the great Italian maritime cities. In the short term, even though Alexius III had recently managed to overcome regional rebels farther west, he was compelled to deal with Kalojan from a position of weakness. According to Kalojan's later account, the emperor even offered him an imperial coronation and a patriarch for Trnovo if he would come to Constantinople. Whether the offer was as generous as Kalojan claimed is impossible to know, but it is clear that Byzantium was now negotiating rather than commanding. Even so, Kalojan did not abandon his discussions with Rome. Early in 1202, probably before his understandings with Alexius III were complete, Kalojan wrote again to Innocent. This time he styled himself emperor of the Bulgarians and Vlachs, and openly asked that papal authority be extended over his lands. He also requested a crown, claiming that earlier rulers such as Simeon, Peter, and Samuel had received royal or imperial recognition from Rome. More than that, he presented himself as their direct heir, as the latest ruler in a long line of Bulgarian and Vlach sovereigns. Innocent answered with care. He addressed Kalojan not as emperor but as lord of the Bulgarians and Vlachs. He acknowledged that there had indeed been earlier kings in those lands, but he also noted that they had followed the Greeks rather than Rome. The Pope, therefore, proposed a cautious next step. He would send his own chaplain to examine the claims on the spot, and in the meantime he would provide an archiepiscopal pallium for Basil of Trnovo. Even before that papal envoy arrived, Kalojan wrote once more, now using Byzantine pressure as a bargaining tool. He informed Innocent that the Byzantine emperor, having learned of Rome's interest, had also tried to win him over, saying in effect that only Constantinople could properly make an emperor and create a patriarch. Kalojan's point was obvious. He wanted the Pope to understand that Rome was in competition with Byzantium for his loyalty, and that if papal support came too slowly, another path remained open. In September 1203, the Pope's envoy reached Trnovo, and Basil received his pallium there. At the same time, Kalojan issued a golden bull of his own, a document that deliberately rewrote the past in order to support the political future he wanted. It claimed that earlier emperors of the Bulgarians and Vlachs had received their crowns, titles, and blessings from the Pope, and that Kalojan was now receiving the same honours. None of this was historically accurate. Earlier Bulgarian rulers had received recognition, when they received it at all, through far more complicated dealings, with Byzantium and the Eastern Church. Yet accuracy was not the point. The document was not meant as careful history. It was meant as legitimacy. Kalojan was remaking the memory of the Bulgarian past so that it would point not toward Constantinople, but toward Rome. It was a bold declaration that his state would look westward for recognition. In February 1204, Innocent III finally replied in a form that largely satisfied Kalojan's practical needs, even if it did not fully match his greatest ambitions. The Pope now addressed him as King of the Bulgarians and Vlachs. He sent a crown and a scepter and laid out the duties expected of a Christian king. Basil was recognized in a way that made him effectively a primate, something close in function to a patriarch, even if the exact word was avoided. He was given the right to anoint, bless, and crown future rulers of the realm. Innocent also granted Kalojan the right to mint coinage bearing his own image. Kalojan accepted this outcome, calling himself King of all Bulgaria and Vlachia. He had decided that a crown from Rome, even with the lesser title of king, was better than an imperial title that depended on Byzantine favour. The decision was deeply significant. It marked a decisive turn away from the political and ideological orbit of Constantinople. At almost the same moment, the papacy also gave its approval to a far more explosive development, the enterprise that became the Fourth Crusade. That expedition did not move through the Balkans in the same way earlier crusades had done, so it did not directly reshape the frontier regions in the same manner. Even so, it formed the dramatic conclusion to the wider rise of Western power that had been gathering strength for generations. Its diversion toward Constantinople was not simply the result of Western greed or accumulated hatred. It was also made possible by Byzantine factionalism. The capital itself had become divided, and rival claimants to the throne were willing to use foreign military force for their own ends. That internal weakness mattered as much as any hostility from abroad. Some historians have tried to identify a single turning point in relations between Byzantium and the Latin West that made the catastrophe of 1204 inevitable. They point to the arrest of Venetians in 1171, or to the defeat at Myriocephalon in 1176, or to the massacre of Latins in Constantinople in 1182. These events certainly mattered. They left scars, created resentments, and shaped the memory of both sides. But none of them made the fall of Constantinople unavoidable on its own. Relations between East and West after those dates remained fluid. Alliances continued to be made, broken, and remade according to political need and economic advantage. The real significance of those moments lies elsewhere. They reveal the character of Byzantine politics in the later 12th century. They show a state increasingly driven by court rivalry, short-term calculation, and the competition of powerful kin groups. In that sense, they were not isolated turning points, but warnings of the deeper crisis that would culminate in 1204. That crisis cannot be understood simply as the failure of one emperor or the result of one bad decision. It grew out of the political structure created under the Komneni and inherited by the Angeloi. The system rested on kinship. Under the earlier empire, access to high office had depended on a mixture of family, ability, and service. Under the Komneni, and even more under their successors, the highest places were reserved for the emperor's own relatives by blood or marriage. This strengthened the dynasty at first, but over time it bred resentment among the wider aristocracy and bitter competition among the emperor's kinsmen themselves. Those same Sebastoi who were supposed to form the ruling core of the state became the most dangerous source of instability. In the northern Balkans especially, nearly every major commander and magnate who mattered in the period between 1180 and 1204 belonged to this aristocratic inner circle, and many put their own ambitions ahead of the survival of the empire. The diversion of the Fourth Crusade toward Constantinople itself was tied to the ambitions of just such a pretender. By early 1204, the gap between the language of imperial power and the reality of imperial weakness had become enormous. Court speeches still celebrated emperors as masters of the world, rulers before whom all others bowed. Yet the very men receiving such praise were often dependent on foreign fleets, foreign soldiers, or fragile city factions. One contemporary speech delivered to the usurper, Alexius, praised him precisely because he had made use of the Venetian Doge and his fleet to secure his claim. The words tried to present this as triumph. In reality, it exposed just how far the empire had fallen. The old practice of bringing a pretender with an invading army had long been known in the Mediterranean world. But now, the pretender was not a fiction. He really was the son of a deposed emperor, and the Venetians believed for a time that he would reward them richly enough to justify their intervention. When he failed, faction inside Constantinople turned against him, and the city was attacked. The assault of 1204 did not succeed because the crusading army was overwhelming in size or because the city's walls had become useless. Constantinople remained one of the strongest fortified cities in the Christian world. Its defences were still formidable, especially in the northern sector where earlier emperors had strengthened the walls. The Crusaders entered not because the walls were weak, but because the city was politically broken. Those in power inside could not act together, could not trust one another, and could not mount a coherent counterattack. The decisive force was not Latin military genius or Greek cowardice, but the disintegration of unity among the ruling elite. The same collapse can be seen from another angle in the changing meaning of what Byzantine writers called the imperial yoke. In earlier generations, that yoke had often rested lightly on the shoulders of local rulers in the Balkans. Many accepted it willingly because it came with money, titles, robes, honours, and profitable access to imperial favour. Under strong emperors like Manuel, subordination to Constantinople could be attractive. The Serbian ruler might receive an imperial bride. The Hungarian king might be bound to the emperor by rank and marriage. Rebels might be bought off with lands and distinction. But after 1180, even as the rewards offered by the empire grew larger, their power to persuade declined sharply. Byzantine prestige ebbed away. Emperors became short-lived, ineffective, or openly manipulated by factions in the capital. Campaigns in the Balkans were entrusted to aristocratic commanders who either failed disastrously or tried to turn their military position into a bid for the throne. In such conditions, the patronage of Constantinople no longer seemed worth much. To many local rulers, a Western patron, whether pope, king, or crusading emperor, appeared more useful and less dangerous than the failing basileus in the east. That loss of prestige can be seen vividly in the behaviour of those who had once sought imperial favour as the highest possible reward. A Serbian prince who had married into the Byzantine imperial family could now dismiss his Byzantine wife with public contempt. A ruler like Kalojan could bypass Constantinople entirely and seek recognition from Rome. The old hierarchy of states, in which neighbouring peoples were supposed to receive legitimacy through the emperor, was no longer believed beyond the empire's shrinking core. The only thing that seemed to spread effectively from Constantinople in these years was not authority, but the politics of faction itself. Rivalry, betrayal, and fraternal conflict radiated outward from the capital and were imitated in the provinces and beyond. So by the opening years of the 13th century, the imperial frontier in the Balkans had not simply retreated geographically. It had collapsed ideologically. The Danube had long ceased to function as the real limit of empire. The mountains had become the practical frontier. Beyond them, in Serbia and in the realm now taking shape under Kalojan, Byzantine authority was no longer feared, desired, or even taken seriously in the old way. The empire that had once imposed crowns, titles, and order across the peninsula was now struggling to defend its own capital from a crusading army brought there by the ambitions of its own ruling class.